Hello and welcome. I hope you all enjoy tonight's cryptid horror stories. The weight of the water. The body arrived on a Tuesday morning in a sealed polyethylene bag that sweated condensation in the morgue's fluorescent chill. Dr. Siobhan Curran stood over the stainless steel table with her arms crossed, studying the corpse through the fogged plastic before she made the first incision. She had been the county medical examiner for 11 years, and she had seen every configuration of death that the Irish countryside could offer. The bloated floaters pulled from Loch Allen, the farmers crushed beneath overturned tractors, the quiet suicides in farmhouses where the hanging rope left a necklace of petechiae. But she had never seen a body like this one. The requisition forms identified the deceased as Dr. Liam McBride, 57 years old, a senior hydrologist with the Geological Survey of Ireland. He had been found by a sheep farmer in a dry pasture 3 miles from the nearest stream, 3 miles from any standing water at all, lying on his back in a field of trampled grass with his mouth open in a perfect O of surprise. Siobhan pulled back the plastic and smelled the body before she touched it. There was the usual sourness of decomposition, the Swedish note of early putrefaction in the abdomen, but underneath it ran a current of something else. The mineral tang of deep groundwater, the ancient smell of stone that had never seen sunlight. She pressed her gloved fingers against the skin of the man's chest and felt the resistance of edema, the subcutaneous swelling that suggested the tissues were saturated with fluid. That was wrong for a body found in a dry field on a warm September morning. A body exposed to air and sun should have been desiccated, the skin tightening against the bone like leather. This man looked as though he had been pulled from a lake after a week of submersion. She began with the external examination, dictating her notes into the recorder in a monotone that she had perfected over years of practice. The subject is a well-nourished Caucasian male, approximately 175 centimeters in length, exhibiting signs of moderate decomposition, consistent with 36 to 48 hours of post-mortem interval. The skin shows a greenish discoloration in the lower abdomen and right flank. There is pronounced marbling of the veins in the chest and neck. She paused, leaning closer to the torso. Notable are extensive patterns of laceration across the anterior and lateral surfaces of the body. These injuries are not consistent with predation. Repeat, not consistent with predation. The wounds covered the dead man from collarbone to knees in parallel tracks that Siobhan at first mistook for claw marks. But when she photographed them at high magnification and studied the images on her monitor, she saw that the lacerations were too regular, too mechanically precise. They ran in sets of 3 and 4, each groove excavated into the subcutaneous fat with the methodical consistency of a tool dragged across soft wood. The edges of the wounds were abraded, as if by friction, and embedded in several of the deeper tracks she found fibers of something coarse and vegetal, material she would later identify, through consultation with a textile historian, as resembling the bristles of a traditional horsehair scrubbing brush. The image that came to her unbidden, standing in the sterile quiet of the morgue, was of a massive hand gripping a brush of coarse hair and scrubbing the man's flesh with rhythmic, relentless strokes, as if trying to scour something from the surface of his skin, or perhaps to scour the skin itself from the body beneath. She moved to the head and neck, noting the absence of the usual ligature marks or signs of strangulation. The eyes were clouded with the milky film of corneal opacity, but the conjunctiva showed no petechial hemorrhaging. When she opened the jaw and examined the oral cavity, she found the tongue protruded slightly, the tip bitten through in a pattern that suggested violent convulsion. The teeth were intact but stained with a dark residue that she scraped onto a slide for later analysis. She worked her way down the body, cataloging the edema, the discoloration, the impossible saturation of the tissues, until she reached the point of the examination she had been dreading without understanding why. The chest cavity opened with the familiar resistance of the sternal saw, and when she lifted the rib cage away and exposed the lungs beneath, Siobhan Curran felt the first true spike of professional fear she had experienced in a decade. The lungs were massive, engorged to twice their normal size, pressing against the pericardium and distorting the shape of the heart beneath. They were not the dark, collapsed organs of a man who had died in a field. They were the pale, distended, and waterlogged organs of a drowning victim. She palpated the left lung and felt the sloshing of fluid within the tissue. She made a small incision and watched as a thin stream of clear liquid poured from the parenchyma into the cavity of the chest, pooling in the hollow where the heart rested. She collected the fluid in a beaker and held it to the light. It was fresh water. She was certain of that even before the lab confirmed it. Not salt water, not seawater, not the brackish solution of a bog or estuary. Fresh water, clean and cold, smelling of limestone and deep earth. She ran the standard diatom test, searching for the microscopic algae that would indicate the specific body of water where a drowning victim had inhaled their fatal breath. The results came back negative for every local lake, river, and reservoir in the county. The diatoms in Liam McBride's lungs belonged to no water source that the Geological Survey had on record. They belonged, according to the paleolimnologist she consulted, to a class of organisms that had not been documented in Irish surface waters for at least 3,000 years. Siobhan sat in her office that evening with the autopsy report spread across her desk and a cup of tea gone cold in her hands. The lacerations, the drowned lungs, the impossible location of the body, the extinct diatoms, each fact was a piece of a puzzle that refused to assemble into any picture she recognized. She thought of the sheep farmer who had found the body, an old man named Cullen who had walked his fields for 60 years and who had told the Gardaí, in a statement that had been dismissed as the rambling of shock, that the grass around the body had been scrubbed clean as a kitchen floor. Every blade bent the same way, like someone had brushed it. She thought of the satellite imagery the farmer had not seen, showing a narrow band of moisture extending from the pasture in a line that pointed, with geological precision, toward the drained peat bogs 3 miles to the northwest. She wrote her final conclusion in the report with a hand that she forced to remain steady. Cause of death, freshwater drowning in the absence of proximal water source. Manner of death, undetermined. Recommendation, further investigation by specialist consultant. She sealed the file and placed it in the outgoing tray, knowing even as she did so that no specialist in the country would be able to explain what had killed Liam McBride, and that the file would sit in a cabinet gathering dust until someone with a reason to look for answers came along. That someone arrived 3 weeks later in the form of Eamon Brennan, and he came not because of the autopsy report, but because of a letter he found in his grandmother's attic, pressed between the pages of a devotional manual that had not been opened in 40 years. Eamon drove from Dublin to County Leitrim in a rented Fiat that smelled of air freshener and previous drivers, taking the N4 through the Midlands and watching the landscape flatten, and then rise again into the drumlin country of the Northwest. The radio played talk shows that he half listened to, discussions of housing crises and climate policy that seemed to belong to a different Ireland than the one he was traveling toward. He was 42 years old, unemployed and technically homeless, though he preferred the term between situations. 6 months earlier, he had been a lecturer in folklore and archaeology at University College Dublin. With a modest reputation in the study of Irish water mythology and a book contract that had fallen through when his primary source material, an alleged eyewitness account of a lake monster in Connemara, had been revealed as a fabrication by a local publican with a talent for storytelling and a grudge against the National Park Service. The scandal had been small by academic standards, but sufficient to cost him his position. The university had offered him a choice between resignation and a disciplinary hearing that would have dragged his name through the professional journals. He had resigned, collected his final paycheck, and retreated to a rented room in Rathmines, where he spent his days drinking too much and his nights writing angry emails to journal editors that he never sent. The letter from the solicitor in Carrick-on-Shannon had arrived on a Thursday afternoon, informing him that his grandmother, Nora Brennan, had died in her sleep at the age of 89, and that her cottage in the townland of Kilnashannog was now his responsibility as the sole surviving heir. He had not spoken to Nora in 15 years. The estrangement had been gradual, a silence that thickened through missed phone calls and unreturned letters, until it became a wall that neither of them knew how to climb. She had been the one who first sparked his interest in folklore, the one who had told him stories of the Dobhar Chu and the Echuus, and the other water spirits that haunted the lakes and rivers of Leitrim, when he was a child sitting by her peat fire. He had loved those stories until he grew old enough to understand that they were stories, that his grandmother's convictions were the residue of a peasant culture that had needed monsters to explain the dangers of drowning and the sudden disappearances of livestock. He had become a scholar to prove that the monsters were metaphors, and when his scholarship failed him, he had blamed the culture that had produced the stories rather than his own willingness to believe them. The cottage sat at the end of a narrow lane that branched from the R280, a single-story stone building with a slate roof and windows that stared blankly at the passing traveler like the eyes of a blind man. Eamon parked the Fiat in the weeds beside the front door and sat for a moment with his hands on the steering wheel, listening to the engine tick as it cooled. The air outside smelled of peat and wet stone and something else, something organic and faintly rotten that he could not identify. He got out and walked around the building, noting the sag of the guttering, the moss that had colonized the northern wall, the field that stretched behind the cottage toward a horizon broken by the low humps of ancient drumlins. In the distance, he could see the earthworks of the development site where the construction firm had been draining the bogs, the machinery sitting idle now, shrouded in tarpaulins like sleeping beasts. The solicitor had left the key under a loose stone beside the door. Eamon retrieved it and let himself into the cottage, bracing himself for the smell of a closed house, the particular odor of dust and mildew and old fabric that accompanied the death of an elderly occupant. But the interior smelled instead of turf smoke and dried lavender, and he realized with a start that someone, the neighbor who had found the body, perhaps, had been in to clean and air the rooms before his arrival. The front room was exactly as he remembered it from his childhood visits, the settle bed by the fire, the dresser with its delf plates, the print of the Sacred Heart that glowed with an unearthly luminescence in the afternoon light. He walked through to the kitchen, noting the modern additions that had accumulated in the years of his absence, the electric kettle, the microwave, the small television on the windowsill, and then climbed the narrow stairs to the attic room where Nora had slept. The bed was made, the counterpane pulled tight, the pillow still bearing the indentation of her head. Eamon stood in the doorway and felt the weight of his absence pressing against his chest like a physical force. He had not come when she was alive because he could not bear to have her see what he had become, and now he was here only because she was dead and could no longer witness his disgrace. The room was small and low-ceilinged, filled with the accumulated objects of a long life, shoeboxes of photographs, piles of knitting patterns, a wardrobe that creaked when he opened it to reveal dresses that had not been worn since the 1980s. He began to sort through her possessions with the mechanical efficiency of a man who had done this before, who had cleared out rented rooms and sold furniture, and reduced his life to what would fit in the back of a car. It was in the bottom drawer of the bedside table, beneath a stack of prayer cards and a rosary with blackened beads, that he found the letters. There were 12 of them, written in his grandmother's careful cursive on cheap blue airmail paper, each addressed to Father Tomás McCabe at the presbytery in Drumkeeran. The envelopes were unsealed, the letters apparently never sent, and Eamon understood immediately that they were the record of a correspondence that had existed only in his grandmother's mind, a one-sided conversation with a priest who had died in 1962. He sat on the edge of the bed and read them in chronological order, the light fading through the single window as the afternoon gave way to evening. The first letters were conventional enough: reports of local news, requests for prayers, the small concerns of a rural parishioner writing to her spiritual advisor. But by the third letter, dated March 1958, the tone had shifted. "The Guardian has been restless," Nora wrote. "The men from the Drainage Commission were here again today, walking the bog with their measuring rods and their maps. I told them what my mother told me, what her mother told her before that, but they laughed and said I was an old superstitious woman. They do not understand that the Guardian is not a story to frighten children. It is a covenant. The people of this place have kept the covenant for generations, and now the covenant is broken." Eamon read on, his skepticism warring with a creeping unease that he could not quite dismiss. The letters described a series of events in the late 1950s that paralleled, with uncomfortable precision, the circumstances of Liam McBride's death. Sheep found dead in dry fields with their lungs full of water. A drainage worker who had disappeared from his tent and been found 3 days later in a limestone cave, his body covered in the same patterned lacerations that Siobhan Curran had catalogued in her autopsy report. The sound that the locals had begun to hear at night, a high-pitched whine that rose and fell like the scream of a rabbit in a snare, but sustained for minutes at a time, echoing across the bogs until the dogs of the village cowered beneath their owners' beds and would not come out until morning. "The Guardian is not a beast to be killed or a spirit to be banished," Nora wrote in the final letter, dated October 1959. "It is a principle. It is the weight of the water pressing against the stone, the memory of the flood that made this landscape. When they drained the bog at Arigna, they thought they were conquering the land. They did not understand that they were opening a door that had been closed for centuries. The Dobhar Chu is not a monster, Father. It is a consequence, and the consequence is walking again." Eamon set the letter down and looked out the window at the darkening fields. The word Dobhar Chu triggered his professional reflexes, the scholar's instinct to categorize and contextualize. The Dobhar Chu, the water hound of Irish folklore, was a creature of lake and river mythology, described in 19th century accounts as a kind of hybrid otter dog that dragged swimmers to their deaths and emitted a terrifying shriek before attacking. Most folklorists considered it a variant of the Kelpie tradition, a water spirit that took animal form to lure the unwary into drowning. Eamon had written about it in his doctoral thesis, dismissing it as a folk explanation for the dangers of strong currents and the sudden drop-offs that characterized the limestone lakes of the region. But his grandmother had not written about a folk explanation. She had written about a covenant, a guardian, a principle, and the details of her letters, the drowned sheep, the lacerated worker, the sonic attacks on the village dogs, matched the forensic evidence of Liam McBride's death with a specificity that exceeded any coincidence Eamon could rationalize. He spent the next 3 days clearing the cottage, but his mind was not on the task. He found himself returning to the letters, reading them again and again, searching for the flaw that would allow him to dismiss them as the delusions of an old woman who had lived too long in isolation. He could not find it. Instead, he found himself driving to the development site one morning, parking the Fiat on the verge of the access road and walking through the mud to the edge of the drained bog. The scale of the destruction was greater than he had expected. What had once been a wetland of international ecological significance, a raised bog that had accumulated peat for 8,000 years, was now a scarred wasteland of black earth and standing water. The drainage ditches that the construction firm had cut through the peat were visible as parallel lines in the landscape, converging on a central excavation where the machinery sat silent. Eamon walked to the edge of the nearest ditch and looked down into water that was the color of strong tea, stained by the tannins that leached from the exposed peat. The smell was overwhelming, not the clean scent of freshwater, but the rank odor of decay, of ancient vegetation exposed to air after millennia of anaerobic preservation. He was about to turn back when he noticed the tracks. They were pressed into the mud at the edge of the ditch, partially obscured by the recent rain but still clearly visible. Impressions of something heavy that had moved from the water onto the land, spreading in a fan pattern that suggested not a walking gait but a dragging, slithering motion. The individual prints were broad and webbed, each toe spreading like the digits of a swimming creature, but the spacing was wrong for any animal Eamon could identify. The stride was too long, the pressure distribution suggesting a body that moved with the undulating motion of a seal on land rather than the walk of a quadruped. He photographed the tracks with his phone and followed them away from the ditch, across a stretch of crushed reeds and into a field of stubble where the imprints became fainter, the mud giving way to drier ground. At the edge of the field, where the stubble met a hedgerow of blackthorn, the tracks stopped abruptly. But the vegetation told a story that the ground could not. The reeds and grasses in a corridor extending from the ditch were bent and broken, not trampled but scoured, each stem leaning in the same direction as if brushed by a massive, methodical hand. Eamon thought of the sheep farmer's description of the grass around Liam McBride's body, and of Siobhan Curran's observation that the lacerations on the dead man's skin looked like the work of a coarse brush. He stood at the edge of the field and listened. The countryside was silent in the way that only rural Ireland could be silent, the absence of mechanical noise so complete that the small sounds, the wind in the hedgerow, the distant cry of a curlew, the creak of his own joints as he shifted his weight, seemed amplified to an unnatural degree. And then beneath those sounds, he heard something else. It was not loud. It was not even, at first, identifiable as a sound at all. It was a pressure in his ears, a sensation of fullness like the change in altitude during a plane's descent, accompanied by a high-pitched tone that seemed to originate not in the air around him, but inside his skull. Eamon pressed his palms against his ears, and the tone increased in intensity, becoming a whine that vibrated in his teeth and behind his eyes. He felt a sudden vertigo, a disorientation so complete that he dropped to his knees in the stubble, his vision swimming as the horizon tilted, and the sky seemed to rush down toward him like a descending curtain. The sound rose to a scream, not in volume but in pitch, pushing against the upper threshold of human hearing, until it became a physical force that pressed against his eardrums with the weight of deep water. And then it stopped. The silence that followed was not peaceful but violent, a rupture so complete that Eamon gasped as if surfacing from a dive. He remained on his knees in the field, his hands pressed against the earth, feeling the vibration of something massive moving through the ground beneath him, a rhythmic percussion like the beat of a heart transmitted through stone and soil. He could not say how long he stayed there, bent forward like a penitent at prayer. But when he finally raised his head, the light had shifted and the shadows had lengthened, and the tracks in the mud had been erased by the rain that had begun to fall in a soft, persistent drizzle. He walked back to the Fiat with a slowness that was part exhaustion and part terror, his body reluctant to move quickly, as if speed itself might attract the attention of whatever had made the tracks and the sound. He drove back to the cottage with the windshield wipers beating a steady rhythm and the heater blasting against the chill that had settled in his bones. That evening, he sat by the fire with his grandmother's letters and a bottle of whiskey that he had found in the kitchen cabinet, and he understood with a clarity that bordered on the religious that he had been wrong about everything. The Dobhar Chu was not a metaphor. It was not a folk memory of drowning dangers or a story to keep children away from dangerous water. It was a real thing, a physical entity that had lived in the dark spaces beneath the earth for longer than humans had walked this island, and it was awake now, and it was angry. He poured another whiskey and opened his laptop, beginning to type notes with a feverish intensity that he had not felt since the early days of his academic career. He compiled the forensic evidence from Siobhan Curran's autopsy report, the historical accounts from his grandmother's letters, the geological data on the limestone aquifer system that underlay the bog. He mapped the locations of the incidents: the drowned sheep, the disappeared worker, Liam McBride's body in the dry field. Each point lay on a line that extended from the breached aquifer to the northeast, toward the coast, following the path of the underground water system that the drainage had opened to the surface. At midnight, he stopped typing and sat back in his chair, staring at the map he had created. The pattern was unmistakable. The creature, he had begun to think of it as the creature because any other term felt like a dangerous euphemism, was not hunting at random. It was following the water. The drainage of the bog had created a new hydrological reality, a network of surface channels and flooded excavations that connected the ancient aquifer to the modern landscape. The Dobhar Chu was a creature of deep water, adapted to the permanent darkness and crushing pressure of the subterranean rivers that flowed through the limestone karst. By draining the bog, the construction firm had not merely disturbed its habitat. They had created a highway. Eamon understood, with the certainty of a man who has finally found the answer to a question he had been asking his entire life, that he was not going to be able to simply sell the cottage and return to Dublin. He was going to have to stay. He was going to have to learn what his grandmother had known, what the people of this place had understood for generations before the modern world had convinced them that their knowledge was superstition. And he was going to have to find a way to stop the thing that was moving through the water toward the village, because if he did not, the death of Liam McBride would be only the first of many. He went to bed that night in his grandmother's room, in the bed where she had died, and he dreamed of water. He dreamed of swimming through passages of black stone, his body elongated and powerful, his senses adapted to a darkness that was not empty but filled with the pressure of tons of earth above and the cold embrace of ancient water around him. He dreamed of surfacing in a world of blinding light and unbearable noise, of creatures that walked on two legs and built structures of wood and stone that blocked the paths of the water. He dreamed of the sound he had heard in the field, the high-pitched scream that was not a scream but a question, a query thrown into the darkness to map the shape of the world. And he dreamed of the answer, the response that came not in words but in the taste of blood in the water, the satisfaction of resistance giving way, the weight of a body sinking into the dark. He woke before dawn with the taste of copper in his mouth and the sheets twisted around his legs like wet seaweed. The rain had stopped, and through the window he could see the first gray light of morning creeping across the fields. He untangled himself from the sheets and stood by the window, watching the mist rise from the ground in tendrils that looked, in the half-light, like the fingers of something vast reaching up from below. He dressed and went downstairs, putting the kettle on for tea, and sitting at the kitchen table with his grandmother's letters spread before him like a hand of tarot cards. He was reading the 7th letter, dated June 1958, when he heard the first sound from outside. It was not the sonic scream of the previous day, but something more mundane. The engine of a vehicle approaching along the lane, the tires crunching on the gravel. He looked out the window and saw a white van with the logo of the construction firm on its side, and behind it a smaller car that he recognized, with a start, as belonging to the Garda station in Drumkeeran. He opened the door before they could knock and found himself facing a uniformed officer and a man in a high-visibility jacket that identified him as the site manager for the development. The officer was young, no more than 25, with the uncomfortable look of someone who had been sent to deliver bad news. The site manager was older, a heavy-set man with a graying beard and the reddish complexion of someone who spent his days outdoors in all weathers. "Mr. Brennan," the officer said, "I'm Garda O'Rourke. This is Mr. Declan Foley from Celtic Horizons Developments. I'm afraid we have some news about your property, sir. There's been an incident." Eamon looked from one man to the other, reading the tension in their postures, the way they stood slightly apart from each other as if unwilling to share the same space. "What kind of incident?" Foley spoke before the Garda could answer. "One of my men didn't show up for shift this morning, Seamus Doran. He's been with the firm for 8 years, never missed a day. We found his truck parked at the edge of the eastern excavation, engine running, door open. There's blood on the seat, Mr. Brennan. A lot of blood. And tracks. The guard I are calling it a possible animal attack, but I've seen animal attacks, and this wasn't any animal I've ever encountered. Eamon looked past them to the fields beyond the lane, where the morning mist was burning off to reveal the green of the grass and the darker line of the distant bog. He thought of the tracks he had followed the previous day, the sound that had driven him to his knees, the dream of water and darkness and the weight of the earth. He thought of his grandmother's letters and the covenant that had been broken, the guardian that had been disturbed, the principle that was now moving through the landscape with the methodical patience of something that had never known the hurry of surface life. "You'd better come in," he said, stepping back from the door. "I think there are some things you need to understand about this place, and I think we don't have much time." They sat around the kitchen table with mugs of tea that no one drank, and Eamon told them about the letters. He told them about the drowned sheep and the lacerated worker from 1958, about Liam McBride's autopsy and the extinct diatoms in his lungs, about the tracks in the mud and the sonic attack in the field. He watched their faces as he spoke, saw the skepticism in the Garda's expression and the growing fear in Foley's, and he understood that he was asking them to believe something that no rational person could accept. But Foley was the one who broke the silence when Eamon finished. "The eastern excavation," he said, his voice rough with exhaustion. "We hit something there 3 days ago. A limestone cave, a big one, full of water that shouldn't have been there. The hydrologist, Dr. McBride, the one who was found dead, he told us to stop, that we were compromising the aquifer system. We didn't listen. We pumped the water out and sent a man down to survey the extent of the cavern. That was Doran. He went down on a rope and came back white as a sheet, wouldn't say what he'd seen, only that we needed to seal the entrance and abandon the eastern sector." "And did you?" Eamon asked. Foley shook his head. "We pumped it dry. We were going to pour concrete today." Eamon closed his eyes. The image was clear now, the pieces falling into place with terrible precision. The creature had lived in the aquifer for centuries, perhaps millennia, in a system of caves and underground rivers that connected to the surface only through narrow fissures and springs. The drainage of the bog had lowered the water table, drawing the creature toward the surface in search of its accustomed depth and pressure. The pumping of the eastern cavern had been the final insult, the drying of its last sanctuary that had driven it out into the world of light and air. "It's not an animal," Eamon said, opening his eyes and looking at both men with a gravity that he hoped conveyed the seriousness of what he was about to say. "And it's not going to stop. You've invaded its territory and now it's mapping yours. It will kill every one of your workers, Mr. Foley, and every resident of this village, until there is nothing left that smells of your chemicals or sounds of your machinery. And then it will follow the water to the next village, and the next, until the entire county is scoured clean." Garda O'Rourke stood up, his chair scraping against the stone floor. "Mr. Brennan, I appreciate your concern, but I think you're letting your grandmother's stories get the better of you. This is a case of a missing worker, possibly the victim of a criminal assault. The blood in the truck needs to be investigated by proper forensic methods, not by ghost stories. I'm going to have to ask you to come to the station and make a formal statement about these letters, and then I'm going to recommend that Celtic Horizons suspend operations until we can determine what kind of animal we're dealing with." "It's not an animal," Eamon repeated, but the Garda was already moving toward the door, his professional skepticism a shield against the implications of what he had heard. Foley remained at the table, his tea cooling in his hands. "What do we do?" he asked quietly, not looking at Eamon but at the window where the morning light was giving way to a sky the color of old pewter. "If you're right, if this thing is real, what do we do?" Eamon thought of the letters, of his grandmother's description of the 1950s incidents and how they had ended. "There was a grave," he said slowly. "Grace Connolly's grave in the churchyard at Fennog. My grandmother wrote about it in her letters. She said the carving on the tombstone was a set of instructions, a guide for the people who lived here on how to coexist with the guardian. I need to see that grave. I need to understand what the people who knew this creature did to survive alongside it." Foley nodded, a small movement that seemed to cost him a great effort. "I'll drive you," he said. "But first I need to see the excavation. I need to see where Doran was." They drove in Foley's van, the guard following in his patrol car with the suspicion of a man who expects to be called back to the scene of a delusion. The eastern excavation lay a mile beyond the main development site, accessible by a track that had been cut through the peat, and was now a channel of black mud and standing water. They parked at the edge of the excavation and climbed out into air that smelled of wet stone and something else, something that Eamon recognized from his dream. The mineral tang of deep water, the breath of the earth exhaled from a wound. The cavern entrance gaped before them, a rectangle of darkness framed by the temporary supports that the construction firm had installed. The floor of the cavern was visible now, a slope of limestone descending into blackness, wet with the seepage that was already reclaiming the space the pumps had emptied. And on the slope, illuminated by the beam of Foley's flashlight, were the marks that told the story of what had happened to Seamus Doran. They were not footprints. They were drag marks, broad channels in the limestone dust that extended from the cavern floor to the entrance and beyond, crossing the mud of the track and disappearing into the reeds that bordered the drainage ditch. The channels were spaced in pairs, suggesting limbs that had pulled a heavy body with the undulating motion of a seal on land. And scattered along the channels, glinting in the flashlight beam like fallen stars, were pieces of orange material that Eamon at first could not identify. He knelt and picked one up, turning it in his fingers. It was a fragment of something organic, flexible and slightly translucent, with a texture that reminded him of the skin of a mushroom. It was orange, the color of a ripe pumpkin, and it curved in a way that suggested it had been part of a larger structure. A flipper, he realized. The creature's flipper, or whatever passed for a limb in its anatomy. The pieces had been torn off or shed as it moved across the rough ground, leaving a trail that was as clear as any written sign. "Jesus Christ," Foley whispered, his flashlight beam trembling as it followed the drag marks into the reeds. "Jesus Christ, what is that thing?" Eamon stood up, the fragment of orange tissue still in his hand. He could feel the wrongness of it, the alien biology that had evolved in a world without light or air, adapted to pressures that would crush a human body and temperatures that hovered just above freezing. This was not a mammal, not a reptile, not anything that fit into the taxonomy of surface life. This was something that had branched from the tree of evolution in the Cambrian darkness, a relic of a time when the Earth's hidden places had been as full of strange life as the surface oceans. "We need to go," he said, his voice sounding strange in his own ears, distant and muffled as if he were speaking underwater. "We need to go now." But it was too late. The sound came again, the pressure in the ears that preceded the scream, and this time it was louder, closer, emanating from the reeds not 50 meters from where they stood. The Garda fell to his knees, his hands pressed against his head, his mouth open in a silent scream. Foley dropped his flashlight and staggered backward, his eyes rolling back until only the whites showed. Eamon felt the vertigo rising in him like a tide, the world tilting and spinning as the sound drilled into his skull with the precision of a surgical instrument. He saw it then, in the reeds, the thing that had made the tracks and the sound. It was not the clear image he would have expected from a horror film, not a monster revealed in the light of a full moon. It was a blur of motion, a distortion in the air that his eyes could not quite resolve into a definite shape. He had an impression of wetness, of surfaces that reflected light in ways that seemed to bend and warp the space around them. He saw the orange flash of a flipper rising and falling, slapping against the mud with a sound like wet leather on stone. And he felt the intelligence behind the sound, the cold assessment of a predator evaluating prey, the territorial rage of something that had been disturbed and would not rest until the disturbance was erased. The scream reached its peak, a frequency that seemed to resonate in the fluid of his inner ear, and Eamon felt his legs give way. He collapsed into the mud, his face pressed against the cold wetness of the peat, and the last thing he saw before unconsciousness claimed him was the orange flipper passing within arm's reach, the wet slap of its movement fading into the distance as the creature moved on toward the village, mapping the territory it intended to claim. Eamon woke in darkness, the smell of antiseptic and ammonia cutting through the mineral tang that still clung to the back of his throat. He was lying on a narrow bed in what appeared to be a medical examination room, his clothes damp and his head throbbing with a pain that radiated from his temples in rhythmic waves. He tried to sit up and found that the room spun around him, the walls tilting at impossible angles before righting themselves with a lurch that brought bile to his mouth. He lay back down and stared at the ceiling, counting the cracks in the plaster, until the nausea subsided enough for him to risk turning his head. The door opened, and a woman entered, silhouetted against the brighter light of the corridor beyond. She was middle-aged, with the compact build and alert eyes of someone who had spent years in a profession that demanded constant vigilance. As she stepped closer, Eamon recognized her from the autopsy report he had studied in his grandmother's cottage. Dr. Siobhan Curran, the medical examiner who had performed the post-mortem on Liam McBride. "You're awake," she said, not as a question but as a statement of fact. "Good. You've been unconscious for 6 hours. I was beginning to think the creature had done permanent damage to your vestibular system." Eamon struggled to process her words through the fog in his skull. "You know," he managed, his voice sounding like gravel in a tin cup. "You know what it is." Siobhan pulled a stool up to the side of the bed and sat down, folding her hands in her lap. "I know what it does," she said carefully. "I know that Liam McBride's lungs were full of water that shouldn't exist, and that his body was covered in abrasions that looked like he'd been scrubbed by a brush. I know that 2 more bodies have been found in the last 48 hours, both showing the same pattern of drowning without water and the same patterned lacerations. And I know that every dog in this village has stopped barking." She leaned forward, her eyes boring into his with an intensity that was half professional curiosity and half something else, something that looked uncomfortably like fear. "The Garda who brought you in, O'Rourke, he's in the next room with a concussion and a case of vertigo so severe he can't stand without vomiting. The construction manager, Foley, is sedated. He kept screaming about wet leather and orange hands until they had to restrain him. You're the only one who seems to have retained any coherence, Mr. Brennan, and I need to know why. What did you see out there?" Eamon told her. He told her about his grandmother's letters and the covenant they described, about the tracks in the mud and the sound that had driven him to his knees, about the glimpse of the orange flipper, and the intelligence he had felt behind the creature's sonic assault. He told her about the aquifer and the drainage, about the highway of water that the construction had opened between the deep caves and the surface world. And he told her about Grace Connolly's grave and the carving that his grandmother had believed was not a warning but a set of instructions. Siobhan listened without interruption, her expression shifting from skepticism to something more complicated as he spoke. When he finished, she was silent for a long moment, her fingers tapping against her knee in a nervous rhythm. "I grew up in Dublin," she said finally. "I don't believe in fairies or banshees or water spirits, but I believe in evidence, and the evidence I've collected in the last week doesn't fit any natural explanation I can devise. The diatoms in McBride's lungs are from a water source that hasn't existed on the surface of this island since the Bronze Age." The lacerations on his skin contain fibers that match no modern textile. And the sonic phenomenon you describe, I've heard it myself, twice now at night from my cottage on the edge of the village. It's not tinnitus. It's not a malfunctioning machine. It's a biological signal, Mr. Brennan, and it's getting stronger. She stood up and walked to the window, pulling back the curtain to reveal a view of the village street below. It was evening, the light fading to a bruised purple, and the street was empty in a way that felt wrong, unnatural. "Look," she said, and Eamon dragged himself upright, fighting the dizziness, to stand beside her at the window. The village of Kilnashannog was a cluster of perhaps 40 houses arranged along a single road that looped through a shallow valley and rejoined itself at the church. In normal times, Eamon remembered from his childhood visits, the evening would have been alive with activity. Children playing in the lanes, dogs trotting behind their owners, the sounds of televisions and radios drifting through open windows. But the street below was deserted, the houses shuttered and dark, and the only movement was the trembling of a curtain in an upstairs window as someone peered out at the gathering dusk. "They've all gone inside," Siobhan said quietly. "They know. They don't need to be told. The old people remember the stories, and the young people can feel it in their bones, even if they don't understand what they're feeling. The dogs are the first to know. Did you notice?" Eamon shook his head, and the motion sent a fresh wave of pain through his skull. "The dogs stopped barking yesterday morning," Siobhan continued. "All of them simultaneously. Not a single bark in the entire village since dawn yesterday. They hide under porches, under beds, in cupboards. They don't eat. They don't respond to their names. They simply cower and shiver, as if they're waiting for something." She let the curtain fall and turned back to face him. "I examined one of them this afternoon, a terrier belonging to Mrs. Gallagher on the main street. Its heart rate was elevated to the point of arrhythmia, and its cortisol levels were consistent with extreme, sustained terror. But there were no physical injuries, no signs of trauma. Whatever the dogs are afraid of, they can sense it in a way that we can't. And if they're this terrified, Mr. Brennan, I think we should be terrified too." Eamon walked slowly back to the bed and sat down, his legs still unsteady from the sonic assault. "We need to find the survivor," he said. "Foley mentioned a worker who went down into the cavern before Doran, someone who came back white as a sheet and wouldn't say what he'd seen. If anyone can describe what this thing looks like, it's him." Siobhan nodded. "His name is Cathal Burns. He's been staying at the bed and breakfast on the Drumkieran Road since the incident. The guard I tried to interview him, but he wouldn't speak to them. He might speak to you, though. He asked about you while you were unconscious. He said he needed to talk to the man who knows about the water hound." They drove to the bed and breakfast in Siobhan's car, a small hatchback that smelled of medical alcohol and old coffee. The building was a converted farmhouse with a sign that creaked in the evening breeze, advertising rooms and full Irish breakfast. The proprietor, a severe woman in her 60s with steel-gray hair pulled back in a bun, met them at the door with a look that suggested she had not had a peaceful night's sleep in some time. "He's in the back room," she said without preamble. "Hasn't left it in 2 days. I bring him food and he doesn't touch it. Just sits by the window, staring at the fields. I don't know what's wrong with him, but I've seen shell shock in my uncle after the troubles, and this looks the same." Cathal Burns was a man in his late 30s, with the weathered skin and calloused hands of someone who had spent his adult life doing physical labor. He sat in a chair by the window as the landlady had described, wrapped in a blanket despite the warmth of the room, his eyes fixed on the darkening fields beyond the glass. When Eamon and Siobhan entered, he did not turn to look at them. He continued to stare at the window, his body rigid with a tension that seemed to vibrate in the air around him. "Mr. Burns," Eamon said softly, approaching the chair with the caution of a man approaching a wounded animal. "My name is Eamon Brennan. I understand you saw something in the eastern excavation, something in the cavern. I need you to tell me what it looked like." Burns was silent for so long that Eamon thought he had not heard. Then, without turning from the window, he spoke in a voice that was barely more than a whisper, dry and cracked from disuse. "It wasn't seeing," he said. "Seeing is the wrong word. You don't see it. You feel it. You feel the wrongness of it, the way it doesn't fit in the world. Like a word in a sentence that shouldn't be there, that makes everything else mean something different." He turned his head slowly, and Eamon saw that his eyes were red-rimmed and unfocused, the pupils dilated to black pools that seemed to reflect nothing. I went down on the rope like I always do, surveying the caverns for the engineers. It was dark, just my headlamp cutting through the black. The water was cold, colder than it should have been. I could feel it through my waders, pressing against my legs like it was trying to push me back up. And then my light hit the wall, and the wall wasn't stone anymore. He stopped, his throat working as if he were trying to swallow something that would not go down. Siobhan moved closer, her professional composure concealing the fear that Eamon could see in the tightness of her jaw. "What was it?" she asked gently. "It was wet," Burns said, and his voice broke on the word, cracking into something closer to a sob. "Everything down there was wet. The stone, the air, my own skin. And something was moving in the wetness, something that wasn't water. I saw the wall breathe, the stone itself rising and falling like a chest. And then the light caught it just for a second, and I saw." He broke off, his hands clutching the blanket so tightly that his knuckles turned white. "I saw a blur of wet muscle. That's all. That's the only way I can describe it. A shape that didn't hold still long enough for my eyes to focus on it, all glistening and rippling, the color of the inside of a fish. And the flippers. God, the flippers. They were orange, bright orange, like something from a tropical aquarium, not this dark place. They slapped against the stone with a sound like wet leather on flesh, and I knew in my bones, that if I stayed down there another second, that sound would be the last thing I ever heard." He was shaking now, the blanket falling from his shoulders to reveal a t-shirt that was soaked through with sweat. "I climbed the rope. I don't remember climbing it, but I must have, because the next thing I knew I was on the surface, lying on my back in the mud with the sun in my eyes. And I could hear it, not with my ears, inside my head, a sound like feedback from a microphone, but alive. Like something was calling out to see where I was, and I knew that if I answered, if I made a sound or moved or did anything to show where I was, it would come up after me." Eamon knelt beside the chair, putting himself at eye level with the terrified man. "Cathal," he said, using the first name deliberately, trying to establish a connection. "Did it follow you? Did it come to the surface?" Burns laughed then, a sound that was worse than any scream, hollow and bitter and devoid of hope. "It didn't need to follow me," he said. "It's already here. It's been here since they pumped the water out. It's been walking the bogs at night, mapping the land, learning where we are. I can hear it in my dreams, that sound, that scream. And I know that it's not hunting for food. It's hunting for territory. It wants this place. It wants all of it. And it's going to keep killing until there's no one left to dispute its claim." He grabbed Eamon's arm with a grip that was surprisingly strong, his fingers digging into the flesh with the desperation of a drowning man clutching at a rope. "You think you can fight it?" he hissed, his breath hot and sour in Eamon's face. "You think you can find some old carving on a gravestone and make a deal with it, like the stories say? But you can't make deals with something that old, something that doesn't even understand what a deal is. It doesn't think like us. It doesn't feel like us. It's water given flesh, pressure given form. And the only thing it understands is that everything that walks on two legs and builds with stone is an infection that needs to be scrubbed from the earth." He released Eamon's arm and turned back to the window, his body seeming to deflate, the energy of his terror exhausting itself in the outburst. "Go to the grave," he said quietly. "Read the carving. Do whatever you think you need to do, but don't expect it to work. The old people kept the covenant because they knew what happened when it was broken. And it's broken now, Mr. Brennan. It's broken beyond any mending." They left him there, staring at the fields, and walked back to the car in silence. The darkness had fallen completely now, a darkness that seemed thicker than natural, as if the night itself were pressing down on the village with a physical weight. Eamon looked up at the sky and saw that the stars were obscured by clouds, but even the clouds seemed wrong, moving in patterns that were too regular, too purposeful, as if shaped by a wind that blew from beneath the earth rather than across it. "The grave," Siobhan said as they reached the car. "We should go tonight before it gets worse." "We don't even know if the carving is still there," Eamon said. "The churchyard at Fennog is centuries old. Gravestones weather, inscriptions fade. The information my grandmother had was from the 1950s. It could be illegible by now." "Or it could be the only chance we have," Siobhan replied. She unlocked the car and got in, leaving Eamon to follow or not. He stood for a moment in the darkness, listening to the silence that was not silence at all but the absence of the sounds that should have been there. No dogs, no birds, no insects. The countryside was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen, and Eamon had the terrible certainty that when it did happen, it would be something that no human being had witnessed in living memory. He got in the car, and they drove toward Fennog, the headlights cutting through the dark like knives through black water. The churchyard was older than the village, a walled enclosure on a rise of ground that had been sacred long before Christianity arrived on the island. The stones leaned at drunken angles, their inscriptions worn by centuries of rain and frost into illegible patterns that suggested faces in their erosion. Eamon and Siobhan walked among them with flashlights that seemed pitifully inadequate against the darkness, searching for the grave of Grace Connolly. She had died in 1722, according to the letters, drowned in Loch Allen under circumstances that had never been fully explained. The legend said she had been killed by a Dobhar Chu, her body dragged from the water with the creature still clinging to her corpse until her husband had killed it with a knife. But the letters suggested a different interpretation, that Grace had been not a victim but a sacrifice, a woman who had entered into the covenant willingly, offering herself to the guardian in exchange for the protection of the village. They found the grave in the northeast corner of the churchyard, beneath a hawthorn tree that had grown so large its roots had buckled the surrounding stones. The headstone was tilted forward at a sharp angle, as if bowing in submission to something that passed above it, and the carving on its face was still visible in the beam of Eamon's flashlight, preserved by the shelter of the tree's branches from the worst of the weather. But it was not what Eamon had expected. He had imagined a warning, perhaps, or a prayer. Instead, the carving was a complex geometric pattern of interlocking spirals and zigzag lines that bore no resemblance to any Christian symbolism he recognized. The pattern covered the entire face of the stone, spiraling inward toward a central image that made his breath catch in his throat. A pair of creatures, rendered in the stylized manner of Celtic art, their bodies intertwined in a knot that suggested both combat and copulation. They were not dogs, not otters, not anything that had a name in the natural world. They were elongated, sinuous, their bodies flowing into fins and flippers, their heads marked with eyes that seemed to stare out from the stone with an awareness that was impossible and terrifying. "It's not a warning," Eamon breathed, his flashlight trembling as he traced the pattern with its beam. "She was right. My grandmother was right. It's instructions." Siobhan leaned closer, her medical mind cataloging the details with the same precision she applied to a corpse. Instructions for what? For appeasement, for coexistence. Eamon's voice was rising with excitement, the scholar's instinct reasserting itself despite the danger. "Look at the pattern. The spirals are water channels mapping the flow of the aquifer. The zigzags are the sonic frequencies, the screams that the creature uses to navigate. And the central image, don't you see? It's not one creature, it's two, a pair, a mate and a guardian." He stepped back, his flashlight playing across the stone, and the full horror of the realization hit him like a physical blow. "The one attacking the village, the one we saw, the one Cathal saw in the cavern, it's not the only one. It's the scout. The male, perhaps, or the younger of the pair. The one that ranges and hunts and defends the territory. but the carving shows two intertwined, which means... Which means there's another one, Siobhan finished, her voice flat with comprehension. A larger one, a mate, and if we've been killing the scout. We've been triggering a morning rage in the Guardian, Eamon said. The female, the one that stays in the deep places that doesn't range unless the pair is threatened. My grandmother wrote about the Guardian being disturbed. She didn't mean the one attacking the village. She meant the other one, the one that's still down there, waiting. And when it comes... He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The sound that erupted from the darkness was not the high-pitched scream they had heard before. It was lower, deeper, a bass note that vibrated in their chests rather than their skulls, a sound of grief and rage so primal that it seemed to emanate from the earth itself. The ground beneath their feet trembled, the headstone swayed on its tilted base, and from the village below came the first human screams of the night. They ran back to the car, their flashlights bobbing in the darkness, the beam of Eamon's light catching glimpses of movement at the edges of the churchyard, the shimmer of wet surfaces, the flash of something orange in the shadows. The sound followed them, rising and falling in waves that seemed to pulse with the rhythm of a heartbeat that was not biological but geological, the pulse of water moving through stone. Siobhan had the keys in her hand, her fingers shaking so badly she could barely insert them into the lock. "The village," she gasped. "We have to warn them." "They already know," Eamon said, his voice hollow. He was looking back at the churchyard, where something was moving among the stones, a shape that his eyes could not resolve into anything coherent, a blur of wet muscle and slapping flippers that passed through the graveyard with the terrible purpose of a tide coming in. They've always known. They just needed someone to confirm what they were afraid of. They got in the car and Siobhan started the engine, the headlights sweeping across the churchyard wall as she turned toward the road. For a fraction of a second, the light caught the creature full on, and Eamon saw it clearly for the first time. Not a dog, not an otter, not anything that belonged to the surface world. It was a mass of pale, translucent flesh that seemed to glow with its own inner luminescence, a bioluminescence adapted to the eternal darkness of the caves. Its body was elongated, segmented in a way that suggested the annelid worms that lived in deep-sea trenches, but the segments were covered in a mucus sheath that reflected light in rainbow patterns like oil on water. And the flippers that Burns had described and that Eamon had glimpsed in the field, were orange, shockingly orange, the color of safety equipment or warning signs, as if evolution itself had marked this creature as dangerous. It was not looking at them. It was moving toward the village, following the line of water that ran in a ditch beside the road, its body flowing over the ground with the undulating motion of something that was equally at home in water and on land. As the car pulled away, Eamon saw it pause at the edge of the churchyard, its head, if that translucent bulb at the front of its body could be called a head, turning toward them with an awareness that was unmistakable. It knew they were there. It knew what they had seen, and it was not concerned because it knew that they could not escape the territory it was claiming. The village was in chaos when they arrived. People were running in the streets, carrying children and dragging elderly relatives toward the church, which had been designated as an emergency shelter in some plan that had never anticipated this particular emergency. Garda O'Rourke was trying to organize a perimeter, his voice cracking with the effort of maintaining authority in the face of the impossible. And from every direction came the sound of water, the rush of the drainage ditches that had been dry for days now suddenly brimming with dark liquid, the gurgle of sewers backing up, the ominous creak of ancient pipes straining against pressure they had never been designed to contain. "The rain," Siobhan said, pointing through the windshield at the sky. Eamon looked up and saw that the clouds had opened, releasing a torrent that was not natural for the season, a deluge that fell in sheets so dense they obscured the houses across the street. The ground, already saturated from the drainage of the bog, could not absorb another drop. The water was pooling in the streets, rising with terrifying speed, transforming the village into a landscape of islands and channels that was eerily reminiscent of the pattern carved on Grace Connolly's gravestone. "It's flooding," Eamon said, but even as he spoke he understood that this was not merely a flood. This was the creature's doing, or at least the creature's opportunity. The water that was rising in the streets was not rain alone. It was the aquifer itself, the deep water that had been held in check by the limestone and the peat now finding new channels to the surface, pushed by pressure from below. The drainage of the bog had created a permanent highway, and now the highway was carrying not just the Scout but the full weight of the water system toward the coast. A woman ran past the car, screaming, her hair plastered to her face by the rain. Behind her, something moved in the flooded gutter, something that was not debris or shadow. Eamon saw the orange flash of a flipper breaking the surface of the water, the pale gleam of bioluminescence beneath the ripples, and he understood with perfect clarity that the creature was no longer confined to the bogs and the fields. It was in the village now, moving through the drainage system, surfacing in the flooded streets, using the water as a highway and a weapon and a home. "We need to get to higher ground," Siobhan said, her voice tight with the effort of control. "The church, it's on the rise, the water won't reach it immediately." "It doesn't need to reach us," Eamon said. "It only needs to reach the pipes, the drains, the spaces beneath the floorboards." He thought of the old cottages in the village, many of them built centuries ago on stone foundations with no damp course, with gaps in the walls where mortar had crumbled and spaces beneath the floors where rats and pipes and now something else could move in darkness. "It's already beneath us. It's been beneath us since the rain started." The scream that answered his words came from inside the house closest to the car, a small cottage with a thatched roof that was sagging under the weight of the downpour. The sound was human, a woman's voice raised in a shriek of terror that cut through the rain and the wind and the lower frequency rumble of the creature's passage. And then it was cut off, abruptly, as if a switch had been thrown, and the only sound from the cottage was the rhythmic slapping of wet leather against stone. Eamon was out of the car before Siobhan could stop him, splashing through the rising water toward the cottage door. He knew it was stupid, knew that the creature was faster and stronger and more at home in this environment than any human could ever be. But the scream had triggered something in him that was older than reason, the instinct of a social animal to protect the members of its pack. He reached the door and threw it open, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness within. The cottage was old, the floor flagstones worn smooth by generations of feet, the walls whitewashed plaster over stone. And the floor was underwater, not flooded, not submerged, but covered in a sheet of water that was no more than an inch deep, a sheet that moved with a rhythm that was not the passive motion of rain, but the active pulse of something swimming beneath it. The water was flowing from a gap in the floor near the far wall, welling up through the stones with the pressure of a spring, and in the center of the room, caught in the beam of Eamon's flashlight, was a shape that his mind refused to process. It was the creature, or part of it. The translucent body was compressed into the shallow space beneath the floorboards, flowing through the gap like toothpaste squeezed from a tube, its segments rippling as it forced its bulk through an opening that should have been impossibly small. The orange flippers were folded against its sides, and the head, the bulbous, eyeless head, was turned toward the woman who cowered in the corner, her back pressed against the wall, her mouth open in a silent scream that had exhausted her voice. Eamon did not think. He acted. He grabbed the iron poker from beside the fireplace and brought it down with all his strength on the segment of the creature's body that was still emerging from the floor. The impact was not like striking flesh. It was like striking a tube of raw liver, a resistance that gave way with a wet squelch and then closed around the poker like a mouth. He pulled back, but the creature held fast, and he felt a vibration run up the metal, a sonic pulse that traveled through the iron into his hands and up his arms, triggering a nausea so intense he fell to his knees in the shallow water. The creature turned toward him. He had thought it eyeless, But he saw now that the translucent head was studded with organs that were not eyes in any human sense but sensors, pits and ridges that detected pressure and vibration and electromagnetic fields. It sensed him, assessed him, and dismissed him as a threat. The bulk of its body continued to flow toward the woman, who was sliding down the wall in a faint, her eyes rolling back in her head. And then Siobhan was there, her medical bag in her hands, and she was doing something that Eamon could not immediately understand. She had opened a bottle of antiseptic solution, something alcohol-based, and she was pouring it onto the creature's exposed flesh, shouting at Eamon to do the same with the whiskey from his pocket. He understood. The creature was adapted to the pure, cold water of the deep aquifer. The alcohol, the chemicals, the foreign substances that the construction had introduced into its environment, these were the irritants that the creature perceived as invasion. He fumbled for the flask in his jacket, his fingers numb from the sonic vibration, and poured the whiskey onto the segment of flesh that was wrapped around the poker. The reaction was immediate and violent. The creature convulsed, its body contracting into a tight spiral that squeezed through the gap in the floor with a speed that was terrifying, leaving a trail of milky fluid that stank of ammonia and decay. In seconds it was gone, back into the drain, back into the system of pipes and channels that connected the village to the aquifer and the aquifer to the sea. Eamon crawled to the woman and checked her pulse. She was alive, unconscious but breathing, her skin cold and clammy with shock. Siobhan was already on her phone, calling for the Gardaí, for an ambulance, for anyone who could help them evacuate the village before the creature returned. But Eamon knew, as he sat in the inch of water on the cottage floor with the woman breathing shallowly beside him, that evacuation was not the answer. The creature was not a predator that could be escaped by running away. It was a force of nature, a principle, the weight of the water given form and purpose. It had been flushed from its sanctuary by human arrogance, and now it was claiming new territory with the methodical patience of something that had waited millennia for this opportunity. The only way to stop it was to understand it, to find the weakness that his grandmother's letters had hinted at, the instructions carved on Grace Connolly's grave that held the key to appeasing a force that did not know mercy but might understand boundaries. He stood up, his clothes heavy with water, his body aching from the sonic assault and the physical exertion. "The grave," he said to Siobhan, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. "We need to go back to the grave. The carving showed two creatures, a pair. And if the carving showed two, then the carving must also show what to do when the pair is threatened. There has to be a way to seal the highway, to close the door that the drainage opened." Siobhan looked at him, her face pale in the flashlight beam, her medical composure cracking around the edges to reveal the terror beneath. "And if there isn't?" "Then we die here," Eamon said simply. "And the creature follows the water to the coast, and then to the sea, and then to wherever the currents take it, and the next village and the next, until someone figures out what we couldn't." They carried the woman out of the cottage and into the rain, toward the church on the hill where the survivors were gathering. Behind them, in the flooded street, something moved in the water, something that was learning the layout of the village with the precision of a surveyor and the hunger of a tide. The scream rose again, the high-pitched echolocation shriek that mapped the territory and identified the prey, and Eamon felt the vertigo building in his skull as he struggled toward higher ground, knowing that the night was not over and that the worst was still to come. The Church of St. Mary stood on the highest point of the village, a Norman structure of gray limestone that had withstood 8 centuries of Irish weather and would, Eamon suspected, withstand 8 more if the creature did not undermine its foundations. They carried the unconscious woman, whose name, they learned from a neighbor who met them at the church door, was Mrs. Deirdre Monaghan, a widow of 70 who had lived in the cottage her entire life, up the steep path to the church entrance, where other survivors were already gathering in a huddle of wet coats and frightened faces. Garda O'Rourke was there, his concussion apparently insufficient to keep him from his duty, though his face was the color of old parchment, and his hands shook as he tried to maintain order. There were perhaps 30 people in the church, mostly elderly, the population of a village that had been hemorrhaging its youth to Dublin and London and Toronto for decades. They sat in the pews or stood in the aisles, their eyes fixed on the doors as if expecting the creature to burst through at any moment, their bodies radiating a collective terror that seemed to thicken the air with a palpable weight. Siobhan commandeered a pew near the altar and laid Mrs. Monaghan down, checking her vital signs with the efficiency of long practice. "She's in shock," she announced to no one in particular, "but stable. We need blankets, warm water, anything to raise her body temperature." The parish priest, a mild man in his 50s named Father Carney, who had never in his life expected to face anything more supernatural than a disputed will, produced blankets from a storage cupboard and helped Siobhan arrange them around the unconscious woman. "What is it?" he asked Eamon quietly, his eyes searching Eamon's face for an answer that would make sense of the chaos. "The people are saying it's the Dobhar Chu. They're saying the old stories are true." "The old stories are more true than anyone wanted to believe," Eamon said. He was standing at one of the narrow windows, looking out at the village below, which was disappearing beneath the rising water with a speed that seemed to accelerate even as he watched. The street was no longer visible, submerged beneath a sheet of dark water that reflected the church's emergency lights in rippling patterns. The cottages that lined the street were islands now, their lower floors flooded, and from several of them came the flicker of flashlight beams as trapped residents tried to signal for help. But the water was not the only thing moving in the village. Eamon pressed his face against the cold glass and watched as shapes passed through the flooded streets below, shapes that were not human and not debris. The creature was not alone. The scout, the one he had seen in the field, the one that had attacked the cottage, was moving through the village with the confidence of a predator that had established dominance over its territory. But there were other movements too, subtler disturbances in the water that suggested something larger, something deeper, something that had not yet fully emerged from the aquifer. "It's mapping the village," Eamon said, more to himself than to the priest. "The high-pitched scream, its echolocation. It's sending out a sonic pulse and reading the reflections to build a picture of the space, like a bat but in water. And the lower frequency, the one that causes the vertigo, that's a weapon. It disorients the prey, makes them stumble, marks them as weak." "How do you know this?" Father Carney asked. "Because I've studied creatures that hunt this way," Eamon said. "Not this creature specifically, but the principle, deep-sea fish, cave-dwelling predators. They live in environments where vision is useless, so they evolve other senses, pressure detection, electrolocation, sonic mapping. This thing, the Dobhar Chu, whatever we want to call it, it's a specialist. It lives in a world of total darkness and crushing pressure, where the only way to navigate is to send out a signal and read what comes back. And now it's applying that same strategy to the surface world." He turned from the window and looked at the frightened faces of the villagers, the old men and women who had grown up with stories of the water hound and had convinced themselves that the stories were just that, stories, metaphors for the dangers of the landscape. They were paying for that self-deception now, huddled in a stone church that might or might not protect them from a creature that had never heard of churches or gods or the concept of sanctuary. "The flooding," Siobhan said, joining him at the window. "It's not just rain. Look at the water level. It's rising faster than any rainfall could account for. And the color, it's not rainwater, it's groundwater." She was right. The water that was swallowing the village was the color of strong tea, stained with the tannins and minerals of the deep aquifer. It was cold, too. Eamon could feel the temperature drop from where he stood, the chill radiating from the flooded streets like breath from a deep cave. The aquifer was bleeding into the surface world, pushed by pressure from below, finding every crack and channel and pipe that connected the underworld to the village above. "The drainage," Eamon said. "When they pumped the eastern cavern, they lowered the pressure in the aquifer system. The water that was held in equilibrium started moving, seeking new levels. And when the rain came, it provided the final push. The aquifer is draining upward now, through every opening it can find, and the creature is riding that flow like a salmon swimming upstream. A sound from below interrupted his analysis. A crash, the splintering of wood, followed by a scream that was cut off with a suddenness that suggested violence rather than rescue. The people in the church gasped and pressed closer together, some of them beginning to pray in whispers that rose and fell like the murmur of a congregation at Mass. Eamon looked out the window and saw that one of the cottages on the near side of the street had lost its front door, the wood ripped from its hinges by a force that was not wind or water. The doorway gaped black against the lighter darkness of the flooded street, and from within came the wet slap of flippers against stone, the sound that Cathal Burns had described, and that Eamon would now carry in his memory until the day he died. "It's in the houses," someone whispered, a voice cracked with terror. "God help us, it's in the houses." And it was. The creature had discovered what Eamon had feared, that the old cottages of the village, with their stone foundations and their gaps in the mortar, their connecting drains and their inadequate damp proofing, were as permeable to water as a sponge. It was moving beneath the floors, between the walls, through the pipe systems that connected each house to the main drainage. The flood was not merely a danger from outside. It was a medium that carried the predator into the most intimate spaces of human habitation, turning every house into a potential trap. Eamon thought of Mrs. Monaghan's cottage, the inch of water on the flagstones, the gap in the floor through which the creature had emerged. That had been only the beginning. Now, with the water rising and the pressure increasing, the creature could move through the entire village as easily as it moved through its native caves, surfacing wherever it found an opening, claiming whatever territory its senses identified as unoccupied by a stronger predator. "We need to get these people out," he said to Siobhan. "Not just higher but away, to higher ground outside the village where the water hasn't reached." "The road is flooded," O'Rourke said, approaching them with the unsteady gait of a man whose inner ear was still recovering from the sonic assault. "I sent 2 men in a Land Rover to check the Drumkieran Road an hour ago. They haven't come back. And the radio is dead. Static on every frequency." "The creature's electromagnetic field," Eamon said. "It disrupts electronics. That's why the construction equipment failed, why the pumps stopped working. It generates a field that interferes with anything electrical." "Then we're cut off," Siobhan said. "No phones, no radios, no vehicles. We're trapped here with that thing in the water, and we have no way to call for help." Eamon looked around the church, at the stone walls that had seemed so solid and now felt like a fragile shell, at the stained glass windows that depicted scenes of biblical salvation, while outside something older and hungrier than any devil claimed the night. He thought of his grandmother's letters, of the covenant that had been broken, of the instructions carved on Grace Connolly's gravestone that he had not yet fully understood. There had to be a way. There had to be a weakness. Every predator had a territory, and every territory had boundaries. The question was how to re-establish those boundaries before the creature claimed the entire county as its own. "The grave," he said again. The carving showed 2 creatures, a pair, and it showed something else, the pattern of spirals and zigzags. I thought they were maps and frequencies, but what if there's something else? What if they're a diagram of the relationship between the creatures? Siobhan stared at him. "What do you mean?" "In animal behavior, pairs often have a division of labor. One hunts, one guards, one ranges, one stays home. The carving showed the 2 creatures intertwined, not fighting, not mating, but connected. Symbiotic. What if the scout, the one we've been seeing, is dependent on the guardian? What if it can't survive without the other's presence?" "And if we kill the scout?" Siobhan asked, though her voice suggested she already knew the answer. "Then we trigger the morning rage," Eamon said. "The guardian comes to avenge the scout, but what if we don't kill it? What if we trap it, contain it? The instructions on the grave, maybe they're not about killing the creature. Maybe they're about controlling it, about establishing a boundary that the creature recognizes and respects. Father Carney, who had been listening to their conversation with growing agitation, stepped forward. "The old people," he said, his voice tentative. "My grandmother used to talk about the Dobhar Chu. She said the families who lived by the lakes had a ritual, a way of keeping the creature in its place. They would leave offerings at the water's edge, not animals, not food, but sounds. They would strike a particular note on a particular kind of bell, a frequency that the creature recognized as a boundary marker. It was like a fence," she said, "but made of sound rather than wire." Eamon grabbed the priest's arm, his exhaustion forgotten in a surge of hope that was almost painful in its intensity. "A sound fence. Of course. The creature navigates by sound, by echolocation. If you can generate a frequency that it interprets as a territorial boundary, a keep-out signal, you can contain it without ever touching it." The carving on the grave, the zigzag lines, they weren't just frequencies. They were a specific pattern, a specific sequence that the creatures used to communicate their territory to each other. "But we don't know the frequency," Siobhan said. "We don't have the bell. We don't even know if the legend is true." "We have something better than a bell," Eamon said. He was thinking of the construction site, of the machinery that had been abandoned when the creature's electromagnetic field had disrupted the electronics. "We have industrial equipment, generators, sonic drills. The construction firm was using high-frequency equipment to break up the limestone. If we can salvage a generator and a speaker system, we might be able to replicate the frequency." "The site is 2 miles from here," O'Rourke said. "Through flooded fields in the dark with that thing in the water, you'd never make it." "I don't have a choice," Eamon said. "None of us do. If we stay here, the water will keep rising and the creature will keep mapping, and eventually it will find a way into this church. The only chance we have is to re-establish the boundary, to close the door that the drainage opened. And to do that, I need to get to the construction site and find the equipment." Siobhan looked at him for a long moment, her face unreadable in the dim light of the church. Then she nodded, a small movement that seemed to carry the weight of a decision. "I'm coming with you." "No, you need to stay here, help these people." "These people have Father Carney and Garda O'Rourke. You have a theory and a desperate plan. If you're going to die trying to save this village, you're not going to die alone." There was no time to argue. The water was rising, the creature was moving, and every minute they delayed was a minute closer to the inevitable. They found what they could in the church: a length of rope, a crowbar from the maintenance cupboard, a battery-powered flashlight that was the only electronic device still functioning, presumably because it was too simple to be affected by the creature's field, and they prepared to leave through the rear door, which opened onto higher ground away from the flooded street. The parishioners watched them go with expressions that mixed hope and resignation, the faces of people who had seen too much to believe in easy salvation, but who could not quite abandon the possibility of a miracle. Father Carney blessed them hastily, the words of the blessing sounding strange in a context so far removed from the normal rituals of the church. And then they were out in the night, the rain lashing their faces, the cold water already seeping into their boots as they splashed through the churchyard toward the relative high ground of the Drumlin Ridge. The landscape had transformed. What had been fields and lanes was now a network of channels and islands, the water flowing in currents that were stronger than any mere flooding should produce. The aquifer was draining upward, the pressure from below creating a hydraulic system that was almost river-like in its intensity. Eamon and Siobhan moved as quickly as they could, keeping to the higher ground, using the flashlight sparingly to preserve its battery, their ears straining for any sound that might indicate the creature's presence. They heard it before they saw it, the high-pitched scream of the echolocation pulse, rising and falling in a pattern that was almost musical in its complexity. The sound came from the direction of the village, behind them, and Eamon realized with a chill that the creature was not following them. It was still in the village, still mapping, still claiming territory. The scout was doing its job, establishing the boundaries of the new hunting ground, while somewhere deeper, somewhere darker, the guardian waited and watched and prepared to avenge any threat to its mate. "How many are there?" Siobhan whispered as they paused at the crest of a drumlin to catch their breath. "The carving showed two," Eamon said. "A pair. But that doesn't mean there are only two. Deep-sea creatures often breed in large numbers, the young dispersing to find their own territories. The aquifer system could be full of them, dozens, hundreds, all connected by the same water, the same pressure, the same ancient instinct. Then what we're seeing is just the beginning. If we don't stop it, yes. The scout is testing the boundaries, seeing how far it can range, how much territory it can claim. If it succeeds, if it establishes this village as part of its range, then the others will follow. The aquifer will become a highway not just for one creature but for a population, a migration from the deep places to the surface world." They moved on, following the line of the ridge toward the construction site. The rain had eased to a drizzle, but the water was still rising, the channels between the drumlins becoming deeper and wider with each passing minute. At one point they had to wade across a channel that was chest-deep, the cold water shocking their breath away, their feet stumbling on the uneven bottom where stones and clumps of peat created a treacherous footing. Siobhan slipped and went under, and Eamon grabbed her arm and pulled her up, both of them gasping and spluttering in the darkness. "I can't see," she said, wiping water from her eyes. "The flashlight." The beam was failing, the battery draining faster than it should, the creature's electromagnetic field interfering even with this simple device. Eamon slapped the casing against his palm, and the light flickered back to something approaching full strength, but he knew it would not last. They had to reach the site quickly, find what they needed, and get back to the village before the light died completely and they were left blind in a landscape of water and predators. The construction site loomed out of the darkness like a scene from a nightmare. The machinery that had been so carefully arranged in daylight was now scattered and half submerged, the excavators and dump trucks standing in pools of dark water that reached their axles. The trailers that had served as offices were tilted at angles, their doors hanging open, papers and equipment floating in the flood. And at the center of the site, the eastern excavation gaped like a wound in the earth, the limestone walls weeping water that was black with peat and sediment. Eamon waded toward the equipment shed, Siobhan close behind, their flashlights cutting through the rain to illuminate the debris-strewn ground. The shed was locked, but the lock was no match for the crowbar, and in moments they were inside, searching through the chaos of tools and materials for anything that might help them generate the frequency they needed. They found a portable generator, a Honda unit that was small enough to carry but powerful enough to run the equipment they needed. And they found something else, a sonic drill, a high-frequency device used for breaking up rock without explosives, its control panel displaying frequency settings that ranged from infrasound to ultrasonic. Eamon had seen similar equipment used in archaeological excavations, the precise frequency control allowing delicate removal of material without damaging fragile artifacts. If he could adjust it to the right frequency, if he could replicate the pattern from Grace Connolly's grave. "Help me with this," he said to Siobhan, and together they dragged the generator and the drill out of the shed and into the rain. The generator started on the third pull, its engine roaring in the darkness, and Eamon connected the drill to the power output, adjusting the frequency dial with shaking hands. He didn't know the exact frequency. He had only the memory of the carving, the pattern of zigzags that suggested a sequence rather than a single note. He set the drill to emit a pulse at the lower end of the ultrasonic range, a frequency that was above human hearing but well within the range that the creature's sensors could detect. The drill emitted a whine that was barely audible, a sensation of pressure in the ears rather than a sound, and Eamon adjusted it up and down, searching for the resonance that would trigger a response. And then he found it. The frequency that made the air itself seem to shiver, the note that caused the water in the flooded excavation to ripple in concentric circles, the pattern that matched, he was certain of it, the pattern carved on Grace Connolly's grave. It was not a weapon. It was a communication, a signal that said in the language of the deep places, "This is the boundary. This is the edge of the territory. You may not pass." The response was immediate and terrifying. From the excavation, from the dark water that filled the cavern entrance, came a sound that was not the high-pitched scream of the scout but something deeper, something older, something that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. It was the voice of the guardian, the mate of the scout, and it was not a question but a challenge. The boundary had been asserted, and the guardian was answering, asserting its own claim with a sonic pulse that made Eamon's bones ache and his vision blur. "It's working," Siobhan shouted over the noise, her hands pressed against her ears. "It's responding." "It's not working," Eamon corrected her, his voice strained with the effort of maintaining his concentration against the assault on his senses. "It's arguing. The frequency I found is a boundary marker, but it's not the right boundary. The Guardian is rejecting it, saying that this territory is already claimed. We need to find the frequency that means return, the signal that tells the scout to go back to the deep places and leave the surface world alone." He adjusted the dial again, moving through frequencies in a desperate search for the one that would trigger the right response. The Guardian's pulse continued, rhythmic and relentless, and with each pulse Eamon felt his consciousness fraying, his sense of balance destroyed by the sonic assault. He was on his knees in the mud, his hands on the drill's controls, when Siobhan grabbed his shoulder and pointed toward the excavation. "Look," she screamed. The water in the excavation was boiling, not with heat but with movement, with the passage of something massive through the confined space. The Guardian was coming. The argument had escalated to a confrontation, and the creature that had remained in the deep places, the larger and more powerful mate, was rising to the surface to defend its claim. Eamon's fingers found the frequency by instinct, a combination of settings that he could not have explained but that felt right in some primitive part of his brain. The drill emitted a new note, a sequence of pulses that rose and fell in a pattern that was almost a melody, and the boiling water stilled. The Guardian's challenge ceased. For a long moment, there was silence in the night, broken only by the rain and the distant rumble of the flooded village. And then from the excavation came a sound that was not a challenge and not a threat. It was a query, a question thrown into the darkness. "Where is the scout?" Eamon understood, with a clarity that was almost telepathic, that the Guardian was not asking about the location of its mate in terms of geography. It was asking about the status, the condition, the survival. And Eamon knew, with a sinking certainty, that the answer he had to give was not the one the Guardian wanted to hear. "We wounded it," he said aloud, not to Siobhan but to the darkness, to the thing in the water that could not understand his words but might understand the frequency of his voice, the stress patterns that conveyed meaning. "In the village, in one of the cottages. We didn't mean to kill it, but we hurt it. We drove it away with chemicals." The response was not sonic this time but physical. The ground trembled, the water in the excavation surged upward in a geyser that drenched them both, and from the depths came a sound that was not sound but emotion made audible. Grief and rage combined into a frequency that bypassed the ears and struck directly at the nervous system. Eamon felt his muscles lock, his heart stutter in his chest. His consciousness threatened to extinguish like a candle in a hurricane. The morning rage. His grandmother's letters had spoken of it, the fury of the Guardian when the covenant was broken, the destruction that followed when the pair was separated by human interference. And now they had triggered it, not by killing the scout but by wounding it, by driving it away, by breaking the bond that held the pair together in their symbiotic relationship. "We need to get back," Siobhan gasped, her face contorted with the effort of fighting the sonic assault. "We need to get back to the village before it does." They grabbed the generator and the drill, Eamon carrying the controls while Siobhan dragged the power unit, and they ran through the darkness toward the village. Behind them, the excavation was a fountain of black water, the guardian rising in all its terrible bulk, its body unfolding from the confined space of the cavern with a wet, sucking sound that was the most horrible thing Eamon had ever heard. It was larger than the Scout by an order of magnitude, its translucent flesh glowing with a bioluminescence that was brighter, more intense, the color of deep-sea creatures that carried their own light in the eternal darkness. And its flippers, the orange flippers that marked both creatures as belonging to the same species, the same ancient lineage, were broader, stronger, capable of propelling it through the water with a speed that no human could match. They ran, and the creature followed, not with the undulating slowness of the Scout on land, but with the terrifying speed of something that was in its element, that had adapted to move through water with the efficiency of a torpedo. The flooded channels that had been obstacles to Eamon and Siobhan were highways to the Guardian, and it moved through them with a sinuous grace that was beautiful and terrible in equal measure. The village was a scene of devastation when they reached it. The water had risen to the level of the church steps, and from the flooded houses came the sounds of destruction, the crashing of furniture, the splintering of wood, the wet slap of flippers against stone. The Scout was still in the village, wounded but not dead, and now the Guardian was joining it, the pair reunited in a rage that would scour the village clean of every human presence. Eamon and Siobhan splashed through the flooded churchyard, the water reaching their waists, and climbed the steps to the church door. It was locked from the inside, and Eamon pounded on the wood with his fist, shouting for Father Carney to let them in. The door opened a crack, revealing the priest's terrified face, and then swung wide to admit them. The church was no longer a sanctuary. Water was seeping through the floor, rising from the foundations, filling the space beneath the flagstones with a darkness that moved. The parishioners had retreated to the pews nearest the altar, their faces lit by candles that flickered in drafts of cold, damp air. And from beneath the floor came the sound that Eamon had learned to fear, the rhythmic slap of wet leather against stone, the movement of the Scout through the drain system, mapping the interior of the church with the same methodical precision it had applied to the village. "It's under us," Mrs. Monaghan whispered, awake now, her eyes wide with a terror that transcended mere shock. "It's under the floor. I can feel it moving." "Everyone up," Eamon commanded, his voice cutting through the panic. "Onto the pews, onto the altar, anywhere above the floor. We need to get above the water line." They moved, the elderly parishioners climbing with a desperation that gave them strength they did not know they possessed. The pews groaned under their weight, the ancient wood protesting, but they held. And Eamon stood at the edge of the water, the drill controls in his hands, watching the floor for the first sign of the creature's emergence. It came from the font, the stone basin near the entrance that held the holy water for baptisms. The water in the font was not holy water anymore but black aquifer water, and it was rising, bubbling, overflowing onto the floor in a stream that spread toward the altar with the inevitability of a tide. And from the font, as the water reached its brim, came the Scout. It was smaller than Eamon remembered, or perhaps it was only that the Guardian's size had recalibrated his sense of scale. But it was still a thing of nightmares, its translucent body glowing with a sickly luminescence, its segments rippling as it pulled itself over the edge of the font and onto the floor. The orange flippers slapped against the stone, and the high-pitched scream of its echolocation filled the church, bouncing off the stone walls and sealing in a cacophony that made Eamon's head feel as if it were splitting open. He activated the drill, sending out the frequency he had found, the boundary signal that had made the Guardian pause. The Scout reacted, its body convulsing, the scream rising to a pitch that was beyond hearing, beyond pain, into a realm of pure sensation. It was not enough. The Scout was wounded, enraged, beyond the reach of any signal that suggested boundaries or territory. It had been driven from its mate, driven from its claim, and now it wanted only destruction. The Guardian arrived moments later, bursting through the floor near the entrance with a force that shattered the ancient flagstones and sent water and debris flying in all directions. The church shook, dust falling from the vaulted ceiling, the stained glass windows cracking in their lead frames. The guardian was a mountain of wet flesh, its bioluminescence turning the interior of the church into a nightmare landscape of shifting shadows and sickly light. And it was looking for the ones who had hurt its mate, scanning the space with sensors that detected not light but vibration, pressure, the electromagnetic fields of living bodies. Eamon stood his ground, the drill screaming in his hands, trying to find the frequency that would turn the creatures back, that would drive them down into the aquifer and seal the highway behind them. But his hands were shaking, his vision was blurring, and the frequencies he tried were met with rejection, with countersignals that battered his senses and drove him to his knees in the inch of water that covered the floor. "The grave," Siobhan shouted, her voice barely audible over the sonic chaos. "The instructions, they're not about frequency alone. They're about the pair. You have to address them as a pair." Eamon understood. The carving on Grace Connolly's grave had shown the two creatures intertwined, connected, symbiotic. The instructions were not for dealing with one or the other but with both together, with the relationship that defined them. He adjusted the drill, not to a single frequency but to a sequence, a pattern of pulses that rose and fell in the rhythm of a heartbeat, the rhythm of the aquifer itself. And he spoke, not knowing if the creatures could understand or even perceive his words, but knowing that the frequency of his voice, the stress patterns, the ultrasonic harmonics that his vocal cords produced without his awareness, all of these were part of the signal, part of the communication. "The scout is not dead," he said, his voice rising above the din. "It is hurt, but it lives. We did not mean to break the bond. We did not know. We are ignorant, not enemies. Return to the deep places, seal the highway, let the water find its old levels, and we will restore the covenant." The guardian paused. For a moment the sonic assault ceased, and there was a silence in the church that was deeper than any silence Eamon had ever known. The creature's head, that translucent, sensor-studded bulb, turned toward him, and he felt the weight of its attention, the ancient intelligence that had evolved in a world without light, without sound as humans understood it, but with a sensitivity to vibration and pressure that made every tremor of the earth a word, every shift of the water a sentence. And then it answered, not with sound but with movement, with a flow of its massive body that carried it back toward the hole in the floor, back toward the water that was its home. The scout followed, dragging its wounded segments across the stone, the orange flippers slapping wetly as it pulled itself toward the guardian. They moved together, the pair reunited, and as they reached the hole the guardian turned one last time, its sensors fixed on Eamon with an awareness that was not gratitude but assessment. The message was clear even without words. The covenant was restored, but it was fragile. The highway was still open, the drainage still creating a connection between the deep places and the surface world. And if the humans failed to keep their part of the bargain, if they disturbed the aquifer again, if they poisoned the water with their chemicals, if they broke the bond a second time, there would be no mercy. The guardian would not negotiate twice. They sank into the water, the guardian's bulk disappearing into the hole with a wet sucking sound, the scout following close behind. The water in the church began to recede, draining back through the hole into the aquifer below, and the pressure in Eamon's ears eased as the sonic field dissipated. He collapsed against a pew, the drill falling from his hands, his body shaking with exhaustion and reaction. Siobhan was beside him, her medical instincts taking over, checking his pulse, his pupils, the signs of shock that she knew too well. Around them, the parishioners were emerging from their hiding places, their faces pale with the aftermath of terror, their voices rising in a babble of prayer and confusion and relief. But Eamon did not feel relief. As he sat in the dripping church, listening to the water recede beneath the floor, he knew that the danger was not over. The creature was gone, but the highway remained. The drainage ditches that Celtic horizons had cut through the bog were still there, connecting the surface to the aquifer. The limestone cavern that they had pumped dry was still breached, still open to the sky. And the rain was still falling, the water still rising, creating new channels, new connections, new opportunities for the creatures of the deep to find their way into the world of light. The covenant was restored, but it was temporary. And Eamon knew, with a certainty that was colder than the aquifer water in his boots, that the true test was still to come. The rain did not stop for 3 days. It fell with a persistence that seemed less like weather and more like intention, as if the sky itself were conspiring with the aquifer to erase the boundary between the surface world and the deep places beneath. The village of Kilnashanog survived, but barely. The floodwaters receded from the church as the guardian withdrew, but they did not recede far. The fields remained submerged. The drainage ditches flowed with dark water that smelled of stone and ancient decay, and the roads that connected the village to the outside world were impassable, transformed into rivers of black mud that no vehicle could navigate. The Gardaí came by boat from Carrick-on-Shannon, bringing emergency supplies and stern warnings about evacuation, but most of the villagers refused to leave. They had lived through the flood, they said, had seen the creature withdraw, and they believed, wrongly, Eamon would later realize, that the worst was over. Eamon spent those 3 days in his grandmother's cottage, dry now but forever marked by the memory of water, poring over the letters with a desperation that bordered on obsession. The cottage smelled of mildew and old paper, the damp having seeped into the walls despite the intact roof, and the air was cold enough that he kept his grandmother's peat fire burning day and night, feeding it with turf from the stack behind the house, until the stack was half gone, and he knew he would need to ration what remained. He sat at the kitchen table with the letters spread before him like a hand of tarot cards, reading them in chronological order, then reverse order, then in the thematic groupings that his academic mind imposed on them, searching for something he had missed, some clue that would explain what had happened and what was still happening. The letters were not the ramblings of a superstitious old woman. They were field notes, observations, warnings passed from one generation to the next in the only language that the old people had trusted. The language of the church, of confession and counsel, of matters that were too serious for casual conversation. His grandmother had written to Father Carney's predecessor in the 1950s, describing changes in the water table, unusual behavior in the fish populations, the sudden silence of the dogs in the village. She had noted the sound that came from the drainage ditches on still nights, not the normal gurgle of water moving through channels, but a rhythmic pulsing, almost like breathing, that synchronized with the heartbeat of anyone who stood close enough to listen. She had described the bioluminescence that appeared in the wells during the autumn months, the cold blue-white glow that rose from the depths like a submerged moon and faded at dawn. And she had written, in the careful script of a woman who knew she was documenting something that would not be believed, about the covenant. The covenant was not a single agreement but a continuous practice, a set of behaviors that the old people had maintained for centuries without fully understanding why. They did not drain the bogs. They did not dam the streams. They left offerings of raw meat at certain points along the riverbank, not as sacrifices to a god but as food for a predator, a way of satisfying the creature's territorial demands without drawing its attention to the village itself. And they maintained the grave of Grace Connolly, keeping the stone clean and the inscription legible, treating it as a boundary marker rather than a memorial. The grave was the anchor, his grandmother wrote, the point where the surface world and the deep places touched without merging. As long as the stone stood and the inscription remained readable, the boundary held. And as long as the boundary held, the creatures remained in the depths, satisfied with the offerings, content to guard rather than to hunt. But the boundary had been broken. The construction firm had drained the bog, breached the aquifer, created a highway between the deep places and the surface that no amount of prayer or ritual could close. The guardian had risen in morning rage, and the scout, the smaller, faster, more aggressive of the pair, had ranged through the village marking territory, claiming the flooded landscape as its own. Eamon had wounded the scout with a poker in the church, driving it back, but he had not killed it. And now, according to Siobhan's reports, the scout was dying slowly in the flooded fields, too weak to return to the depths but too territorial to abandon its claim. Siobhan came each evening, walking the flooded lanes with her medical bag, checking on the elderly residents who had refused evacuation, treating cases of hypothermia and shock and the creeping respiratory infections that followed prolonged exposure to cold water. She arrived at the cottage each night as the light was failing, her boots muddy, her face drawn with exhaustion, and she reported to him what she had seen. The construction firm had suspended all operations indefinitely, the equipment abandoned at the excavation sites, the workers evacuated by helicopter. The government had declared the area a flood zone and was promising relief that would arrive too late to matter, and the scout was still out there. "It's circling the village," she told him on the second evening, sitting by the fire with a cup of tea that steamed in the damp air. Her hands were shaking slightly, Eamon noticed, a tremor that she tried to hide by wrapping her fingers around the warm mug. "I found tracks this morning near the eastern excavation. The wound you inflicted with the poker, it's not healing. There's a trail of milky fluid leading from the cavern entrance to the drainage ditches. It's some kind of discharge, maybe analogous to pus, maybe something else entirely. The creature is circling, not entering the village but not leaving either." "It's waiting to die," Eamon said, not looking up from the letter he was reading. "Or waiting for something else." "What else could it be waiting for?" Eamon set down the letter and looked at her. In the firelight, her face was a mask of gold and shadow, the lines of exhaustion etched deep around her eyes and mouth. She had seen too much in the past week, had touched too many bodies that should not have existed, had felt the pressure of the creature's scream in her bones. She was not the same woman who had performed the autopsy on Liam McBride with clinical detachment. She was someone else now, someone who had learned that the world contained predators older and stranger than any medical textbook could describe. "The scout and the guardian are a pair," Eamon said, "not just mates, symbiotic. They share a nervous system, a sensory network, maybe even a consciousness. The scout ranges and hunts, the guardian stays in the deep places and maintains the territory. If the scout dies, the guardian feels it, not as grief, as physical trauma, a feedback loop of pain that amplifies with every passing moment. The morning rage we saw in the church, that was just the beginning. If the scout dies while the guardian is still alive, the feedback loop becomes permanent. The guardian loses its anchor, its connection to the surface world. It becomes a rogue predator, uncontrolled, unbounded, ranging farther and farther in search of a new mate." Siobhan set down her tea. "So we need to keep the scout alive. We need to do more than that. We need to reunite the pair. We need to send the scout back to the guardian, restore the bond, and then convince the guardian to close the highway. To collapse the cavern, block the drainage, restore the boundary." "And how do we do that?" Eamon picked up the 7th letter in the series, dated July 1958. "My grandmother described a similar situation, a wounded scout that lingered near the surface after the covenant was disturbed. The old people dealt with it by performing a ritual at Grace Connolly's grave, a ceremony involving sound and salt and the offering of something precious. I don't know if the ritual actually worked, or if it was just a way of marking time until the creature healed on its own, but I know that the grave is important. The carving on the stone, there's something I missed when we were there before, something that only makes sense now that I've seen the creatures in person." "You want to go back to the grave?" "Tonight, alone. The carving shows the creatures intertwined, their bodies connected in a pattern that mirrors their neurological bond. But there's something else, something at the base of the stone. I need to see it in the moonlight without the pressure of the creature hunting us. I need to understand what the old people knew." Siobhan was silent for a long moment, watching the fire. Then she stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the flooded fields where the last light of dusk was fading into darkness. "The scout is near the grave," she said quietly. "I found its tracks leading toward Fenog this afternoon. It's guarding the stone, Eamon. It knows that the carving holds the key to its fate, and it's waiting for anyone who tries to read it." "Then I'll have to be careful." "You'll have to be more than careful. You'll have to be invisible." She turned back to him, her face serious. "The creature doesn't see like we do. It senses electromagnetic fields, vibrations, pressure changes. If you move slowly, if you don't disturb the water, if you keep your heartbeat steady, you might get close enough to read the stone before it notices you." "And if it notices me?" "Then run," Siobhan said. "Run faster than you've ever run in your life, and don't stop until you're back in this cottage with the door barred. Because if that thing catches you in the open, alone, with no one to help, you'll end up like Liam McBride, like Seamus Doran, like all the others who thought they could stand against it and failed." Eamon packed a bag as the last light faded. A flashlight, salt, the antique tuning fork he had found in his grandmother's drawer, and a bottle of holy water that Father Carney had pressed into his hands that morning with a prayer and a warning. He did not know if any of these things would help, but he knew that the ritual required intention as much as material, and he intended to finish what the construction firm had started. The walk to Fenog took longer than he remembered. The flooded fields had transformed the landscape into a maze of channels and islands, and he had to detour several times to avoid stretches where the water was too deep to wade. The moon was full, casting a silver light that made the water glow with an unearthly luminescence, and the air was cold enough that his breath steamed in front of his face. He walked with his flashlight off, navigating by moonlight, his ears alert for any sound that might indicate the scout's presence. The silence was absolute. No birds, no insects, no wind in the trees. The world had become a still life of water and stone and shadow, and Eamon moved through it like a ghost, his feet finding purchase on the submerged ground, his hands occasionally reaching out to steady himself against the walls of fieldstone that divided one plot from another. The water reached his knees, then his thighs, then receded to his ankles as he found higher ground, only to rise again as he descended into another channel. It was like walking through the veins of some massive creature, the channels carrying not blood but black water that smelled of peat and decay and something else, something that reminded him of the inside of a cave, the mineral sharpness of stone that had never seen sunlight. He heard it before he saw it, the wet slap of the orange flipper against stone, the sound that had become the signature of the creature's passage. It was not close, perhaps 200 yards to the north, near the churchyard, but the sound carried in the still air with a clarity that was almost supernatural. Eamon froze, his heart hammering against his ribs, and forced himself to breathe slowly, deeply, to lower his heart rate, to become invisible to whatever senses the creature used to hunt. The sound came again, closer this time, and then a third time, moving away, circling the churchyard in a pattern that suggested patrol rather than pursuit. The scout was guarding the grave, just as Siobhan had said, making regular circuits of the churchyard wall to ensure that no one approached the stone without being detected. Eamon watched from his position behind a half-submerged hedge, his eyes straining to see through the moonlight, and after 10 minutes of patient observation, he had mapped the creature's route. A slow circle that took approximately 8 minutes to complete, with a pause of 30 seconds at the eastern corner where the wall was lowest and the view of the gravestone was clearest. He timed his approach to coincide with the creature's pause at the western corner, moving through the water with agonizing slowness, lifting each foot clear of the surface before setting it down again to minimize the splash and ripple that might alert the scout to his presence. The water was cold, shockingly cold, and he could feel the numbness spreading from his feet up his legs, the muscles in his calves cramping with the effort of moving silently through the resistance of the flood. But he did not stop. He kept his eyes fixed on the churchyard wall, counting the seconds in his head, measuring his progress against the creature's circuit, and he reached the wall at the exact moment the scout was at its farthest point, pausing at the eastern corner with its sensors turned away from Eamon's position. The wall was old, built of field stones mortared together with lime, and it had survived centuries of weather and neglect. Eamon climbed it slowly, his fingers finding holds in the gaps between the stones, his boots scraping softly against the rough surface, and he froze at the top, one leg thrown over, waiting for the sound of the creature's approach. But the scout did not move from its position at the eastern corner. It was resting, Eamon realized, its damaged body conserving energy, its patrol slowing as its strength faded. He lowered himself over the wall and dropped into the churchyard, landing softly on the wet grass, and crouched there for a long moment, listening. The churchyard was smaller than he remembered, or perhaps the flood had altered the proportions, the water that seeped through the wall making the ground spongy and treacherous. The gravestones leaned at angles that suggested geological instability, their inscriptions worn smooth by centuries of rain, and the hawthorn tree that overshadowed Grace Connolly's grave was a black silhouette against the moon, its branches bare, its roots exposed by the erosion of the flood. The air smelled of rotting leaves and wet stone and something else, something that Eamon recognized from the church. The faint ozone tang of the creature's bioluminescence, the chemical sharpness of its metabolism. The scout was there. It lay coiled around Grace Connolly's gravestone like a serpent around a tree, its translucent body glowing with a faint bioluminescence that was barely visible in the moonlight. The wound that Eamon had inflicted was visible as a dark patch on one of its segments, a bruise that spread like an oil slick through the creature's pale flesh. The orange flippers were folded against its sides, but they twitched occasionally, slapping against the stone with that wet leather sound that Eamon had learned to associate with the creature's restless energy. It was dying. He could see that now, could read the signs of exhaustion in the dimming glow, the shallow rhythm of its segments' undulations, the way its head, that sensor-studded bulb, hung low against the stone as if too heavy to lift. The wound had weakened it, the chemicals had poisoned it, and without the Guardian's presence to sustain it through their shared nervous system, the scout was fading. Its bioluminescence pulsed weakly, irregularly, like a failing heartbeat, and Eamon felt something unexpected as he watched it. Not fear, not hatred, but pity. The creature was a predator, yes, but it was also a living thing, a product of evolution that had adapted to an environment more hostile than any human could survive, and it was dying because humans had disturbed the balance that had kept it alive for millennia. He approached the gravestone with the caution of a man entering a predator's territory, keeping his movements slow and deliberate, keeping his breathing shallow and silent. The scout raised its head as he drew near, the sensors focusing on him with an effort that was almost pathetic in its slowness. The high-pitched scream of its echolocation was weak, barely more than a whisper of pressure in his ears, and he understood that it no longer had the strength to attack him. It could only watch and wait and die. The carving was clearer in the moonlight than it had been in the darkness of their first visit. The interlocking spirals, the zigzag lines, the central image of the intertwined pair, all of it was visible in the silver light, the stone worn smooth by centuries of rain, but the pattern still legible to anyone who knew how to read it. Eamon knelt before the stone and traced the carving with his fingers, feeling the ridges and grooves that his ancestors had cut into the limestone with tools of iron and patience. And he saw what he had missed before. The spirals were not just water channels. They were a map of the aquifer system, the underground rivers and caves that connected the deep places to the surface. The zigzag lines were not just frequencies. They were the sonic boundaries, the signals that the creatures used to mark their territory. And the central image, the intertwined pair, was not just a representation of the creatures. It was a diagram of the relationship, the symbiotic connection that allowed them to survive in an environment that was hostile to solitary life. But there was something else, something that Eamon had not noticed in his first hurried examination. At the base of the stone, below the central image, there was a second carving, smaller and less elaborate, that showed a single creature rather than a pair. A solitary figure, its body elongated and its flippers extended, moving through a spiral that led downward into the earth. And beside the figure, carved in a simpler style that suggested a different hand or a different time, were symbols that Eamon recognized from his academic studies. Ogham script, the ancient Irish alphabet of lines and notches that predated the Roman letters. He leaned closer, his flashlight in his hand now, playing the beam across the ancient script. He had studied Ogham in his undergraduate days, learned to read the inscriptions on standing stones and boundary markers that dotted the Irish landscape. The script was simple, each letter represented by a series of notches cut across a stemline, and he had thought he had forgotten the skill until he found himself deciphering the message almost automatically. "When the pair is broken," he read aloud, his voice barely more than a whisper in the silent churchyard, "the solitary one must be guided to the deep places, not by force but by the weight of the water. The water remembers the path, the water holds the weight, and the weight must be returned to where it belongs." He sat back on his heels, the meaning of the inscription slowly penetrating his understanding. The old people had known that the creatures could not be killed, could not be driven away by violence. They could only be guided, herded, directed back to their proper place through the manipulation of the water itself. The weight of the water, the pressure, the depth, the cold darkness of the aquifer, was the force that kept the creatures in the deep places. When that weight was disturbed, when the water was drained or diverted, the creatures rose to the surface. And the only way to send them back was to restore the weight, to return the water to its proper level and pressure, to close the highway that had been opened. But the Guardian had to do it. The Guardian had the strength, the size, the power to collapse the cavern entrance, to block the drainage channels, to restore the pressure that kept the deep places separate from the world above. And the Guardian would only act if it had a reason, if the threat to its mate was sufficient to motivate the expenditure of energy. Eamon looked at the Scout, dying in the moonlight, its bioluminescence fading to almost nothing. He understood now what he had to do. He had to carry the Scout to the excavation, to the breached aquifer, to the place where the highway began. He had to reunite the pair, restore the bond, and then convince the Guardian to close the road that humans had opened. It was madness. It was suicide. The creature might revive and kill him the moment he touched it. The Guardian might rise and destroy him before he could explain his intentions. The flood might drown him before he reached the excavation. But it was the only way. The only way to save the village, to restore the boundary, to pay the debt that his species had incurred by disturbing the deep places. He struck the tuning fork against the gravestone, and the clear tone rang out in the churchyard, pure and cold as the moonlight. The Scout tensed, its sensors focusing on the sound with an intensity that suggested recognition. Eamon held the fork close to the creature's head, letting the vibrations travel through the air into the sensor organs, and he saw the bioluminescence flicker, strengthen, fade again. It was not enough. The tuning fork was too simple, too primitive to generate the complex frequencies that the creature's nervous system required. But it might keep the Scout alive long enough for him to carry it to the excavation. It might sustain the connection to the Guardian, however weakly, until the pair could be reunited. Eamon took a deep breath, steeling himself for what came next. He reached out with both hands and touched the creature's flesh. It was cold, wet, the texture of a mushroom or the underside of a fish, and he could feel the vibration of its failing nervous system, the erratic pulse that was slowing, stuttering, approaching silence. The Scout did not resist as he lifted it from the ground. It was lighter than he expected, its body mostly water and gelatinous tissue, its translucent flesh cool against his hands. The creature's segments rippled weakly as he cradled it against his chest, its orange flippers dangling limply against his arms, and he felt a vibration through his sternum that might have been the creature's heartbeat, or might have been the tuning fork's resonance, transmitted through bone and muscle into the failing body of the predator he was trying to save. He climbed over the churchyard wall with the scout in his arms, the creature's bioluminescence pulsing faintly against his jacket, and he stood for a moment in the flooded field beyond, orienting himself toward the eastern excavation. The moon was high now, casting a silver path across the water that seemed to point the way, and the rain had stopped, leaving the air clear and cold and filled with the smell of wet earth. In the distance toward the excavation, he heard something move in the water. Not the scout. He could feel the scout's weight in his arms, its weak struggles against his grip. Something else. Something larger. The guardian, perhaps, sensing its mate's approach through the shared nervous system, rising from the depths to meet them. Eamon began to walk, carrying the dying water hound through the flooded fields toward the place where the weight of the water waited to reclaim what had always belonged to it. The flooded fields were a labyrinth of black water and silver moonlight, a landscape that had ceased to obey the geometry of human agriculture and become something else entirely, a wetland that breathed and shifted with every step Eamon took. He carried the scout against his chest like a drowned infant, its translucent body cold and heavy and wrong against his skin, and he felt its bioluminescence pulsing in rhythm with his own heartbeat. The two organisms locked in a parasitic embrace that neither had chosen, but both were now bound by. The tuning fork hung around his neck on a leather cord, struck once before he left the churchyard, and now vibrating faintly with a residual tone that he could feel in his teeth more than hear in his ears, a constant reminder of the bargain he was attempting to broker. The water reached his waist in the lowest channels, the current tugging at his legs with an insistence that was almost intelligent, as if the flood itself were trying to pull him toward the excavation or away from it. He could not tell which. He moved with the careful deliberation of a man carrying explosives, each foot placed with precision, each shift of weight calculated to minimize splash and noise. The scout was growing heavier with every step, its body absorbing water through the porous membrane of its skin, its segments rippling weakly against his ribs in a pattern that might have been distress, or might have been the reflexive spasms of a dying nervous system. He had been walking for 20 minutes when he heard the sound behind him, not the wet slap of the orange flipper against stone. The scout's flippers were folded against its sides, motionless now, too weak to move, but something else. Something that sounded at first like the wind rising through the trees, a low moan that built in intensity until it became a pressure in his ears rather than a sound in the air. The guardian was listening. The guardian knew that its mate was moving, knew that something was carrying it through the flooded fields, and it was sending out pulses of echolocation that traveled through the water and the earth and the bones of Eamon's skull to map the shape of the world above. The vertigo hit him without warning, the same disorienting nausea that he had felt in the church when the guardian first screamed. The world seemed to tilt, the horizon rising on one side and falling on the other, and Eamon stumbled, his knees buckling, the scout almost slipping from his grasp. He caught himself, his free hand plunging into the black water to steady his balance, and he forced his eyes to focus on the fixed point of the moon, using its steady light as an anchor against the spinning world. The pressure in his ears increased, a high-pitched whine that seemed to come from inside his head rather than outside it, and he understood that the guardian was interrogating him, probing his electromagnetic field, his heartbeat, his brain waves, searching for the pattern that would tell it whether he was a threat or a deliverer. "I'm bringing it to you," he whispered into the darkness, his voice cracking with exhaustion and fear. "Your mate, I'm bringing it back. Don't kill me, please don't kill me." The pressure eased, fractionally, barely enough to notice, but enough that Eamon could straighten his legs and resume walking. The guardian had understood, or at least it had decided not to kill him yet. The echolocation continued, a constant presence in his head like a second heartbeat, but it was no longer attacking him. It was following him, tracking his progress, waiting to see if he would fulfill his promise. The eastern excavation emerged from the darkness as a black lake in the moonlight. The pit that the construction firm had dug now filled with water that reflected the sky like a mirror. The equipment stood in silhouette around the perimeter, excavators with their booms raised, dump trucks with their beds empty, the sonic drill that had breached the aquifer now silent and dark. The flood had transformed the site into a graveyard of industrial ambition. The machines that had disturbed the deep places, now monuments to the folly of believing that technology could tame something older than stone. Eamon waded to the edge of the pit and looked down into the water. It was black, perfectly black, absorbing the moonlight rather than reflecting it, and he knew that the cavern entrance was somewhere below that surface, the connection to the aquifer that the drilling had opened. The Guardian was down there. He could feel it in the pressure in his ears, the vibration in his feet, the sense of being watched by something massive and patient and absolutely focused on the creature in his arms. The scout was dying. He could feel it now, could feel the last sparks of its bioluminescence fading against his chest, the segments rippling in a pattern that was no longer rhythmic but chaotic, the death spasms of a nervous system that was shutting down cell by cell. The wound that the poker had inflicted was visible as a dark tear in the translucent flesh, the edges blackened by chemical poisoning, and the milky discharge that Siobhan had described was flowing freely now, staining Eamon's jacket with a fluid that smelled of ammonia and rotting vegetation. He had to act. He had to get the scout into the water, had to reunite the pair before the nervous system failed completely and the feedback loop of death began. But the water was deep, and he could not swim while carrying the creature, and if he simply dropped it over the edge it might sink too fast, might miss the cavern entrance, might die in the cold darkness before the Guardian could reach it. He descended the slope of the excavation with painful slowness, his boots sliding on the mud, his arms cramping from the weight of the scout. The water rose around his legs, his hips, his chest, until he was standing waist-deep in the black pool with the creature held above the surface, its bioluminescence the only light in the darkness. He turned in a slow circle, looking for the cavern entrance, and then he saw it, a darker patch in the black water, a void that seemed to absorb even the faint light of the scout's dying glow, a passage that led downward into the earth. "Here," he whispered, not knowing if the Guardian could hear him, not knowing if the word meant anything to a creature that communicated in frequencies beyond human hearing. "I'm here. Come and get it. Come and get your mate." The water stirred, not with wind, not with current, but with the passage of something massive beneath the surface. Eamon felt the pressure wave before he saw the movement, the displacement of water that signaled the approach of a body larger than any whale, larger than any submarine, a body that had evolved in the crushing darkness of the Earth's hidden places. The Guardian rose. It did not breach the surface like a whale, did not explode into the air in a display of power. It rose slowly, deliberately, its translucent bulk emerging from the black water with the inevitability of a tide. The bioluminescence that suffused its body was brighter than the scout's had ever been, a cold blue-white glow that turned the excavation into an underwater cathedral, the water itself seeming to glow with the creature's inner light. The Guardian was easily 30 feet long, its body segmented into rippling sections that flowed into one another with the smoothness of water itself. The orange flippers were broad and powerful, each one large enough to crush a human skull with a single slap. And the head, that sensor-studded bulb that passed for a head, was turned toward Eamon with an awareness that was ancient, patient, and absolutely focused. Eamon felt his mind begin to fracture under the pressure of the creature's presence. The Guardian was not just a physical entity. It was an electromagnetic phenomenon, a living generator that produced fields strong enough to disrupt electronics, to induce vertigo, to rewrite the chemistry of the human brain. Standing this close to it, with the water conducting its field directly into his body, Eamon felt his thoughts beginning to unravel, his memories surfacing unbidden, his sense of self dissolving into a soup of sensory input that had no meaning and no boundary. He saw his grandmother's face, not as he remembered it from childhood, but as she must have looked in the 1950s, young and fierce and afraid. He saw the construction worker Seamus Doran, not dead on the autopsy table but alive in the cavern, his last moments replayed in Eamon's mind with the clarity of direct experience. He saw Grace Connolly, the woman whose grave had become the anchor of the Covenant, her death in the lake replayed not as history but as present reality, the weight of the water pressing down, the orange flippers dragging her under, the bioluminescence fading as her lungs filled with fresh water. And he saw the Guardian's own memories, or what passed for memories in a creature that had no language and no culture, but only instinct and sensation. He saw the deep places, the caverns that extended for miles beneath the surface, the rivers of black water that flowed through stone channels older than any human civilization. He saw the Guardian's mate, the Scout, not as a separate creature, but as an extension of the Guardian's own body, their nervous systems intertwined in a dance of shared perception that made the distinction between self and other meaningless. He saw the joy of the hunt, the satisfaction of the kill, the territorial imperative that drove the pair to mark and defend their domain against all intruders. And he saw the rage, the mourning rage that would follow if the bond was broken, the feedback loop of pain that would transform the Guardian from a territorial predator into an instrument of absolute destruction. "I'm giving it back," Eamon gasped, his voice barely audible above the pressure in his head. "I'm giving your mate back. Take it and close the highway, collapse the cavern, block the drainage, restore the weight of the water." He lowered the Scout into the water, letting the creature's body slip from his hands into the darkness. The Scout's bioluminescence flared once, weakly, as the water closed over it, and then the Guardian moved, its bulk flowing through the water with a speed that was terrifying in its ease. It coiled around the Scout, its segments interlocking with the smaller creatures in a pattern that mirrored the carving on Grace Connolly's grave, and Eamon actually felt, through the soles of his feet and the bones of his skull, the reconnection of their nervous systems. The Scout's bioluminescence strengthened, fed by the Guardian's greater energy, its damaged tissues beginning to repair themselves in the cold embrace of the water. The pair was reunited, the bond restored, and Eamon felt the shift in the Guardian's attention as it turned from its mate to the human who had returned it. The message was clear, transmitted not in words but in the frequency of the creature's sonic pulse, the pressure wave that washed over Eamon like a physical touch. The Covenant was honored. The highway would be closed. But the price was this: Eamon would never speak of what he had seen. He would never return to this place. He would leave the village and never come back, because the Guardian remembered his scent now, his electromagnetic signature, the unique pattern of his heartbeat and his brain waves. And if he ever returned, if he ever disturbed the deep places again, the Guardian would not negotiate. It would hunt him to the ends of the earth, through any water that connected to the aquifer, through any pipe or stream or ocean current that led back to the darkness beneath the stone. Eamon nodded, understanding the terms, accepting them without question. He backed away from the excavation, the water receding around his legs, and watched as the Guardian turned its massive bulk toward the cavern entrance. The Scout clutched against its segments in a protective embrace. The creature's body began to glow more intensely, the bioluminescence pulsing in a rhythm that matched the beat of Eamon's own heart, and then it dived, its flippers slapping the surface once in a sound that was almost gentle, a farewell or perhaps a warning, and disappeared into the darkness below. The water in the excavation began to move, not with the turbulence of the Guardian's passage, but with a directed flow, as if something were pushing from below, forcing the water through channels, collapsing passages, sealing breaches. Eamon felt the vibration in his feet, the seismic rumble of limestone grinding against limestone, and he understood that the Guardian was fulfilling its part of the bargain. It was collapsing the cavern, blocking the drainage, restoring the weight of the water to its proper level. He turned and walked away, not running, not hurrying, but moving with the deliberate pace of a man who had made a deal with something older than his species, and who knew that the only way to survive was to honor that deal completely. He did not look back. He did not need to. The sound of the collapsing cavern followed him through the night, the grinding of stone and the rushing of water, and when he reached the village the dawn was breaking and the floodwaters were receding, draining back into the earth as if a plug had been pulled, leaving the fields muddy and gasping but no longer drowned. Siobhan was waiting for him at the cottage, her face pale in the early light, her medical bag in her hand. She looked at him, at his mud-caked clothes, his empty arms, his eyes that held something she had never seen before, and she did not ask what had happened. She simply nodded as if she had known all along and stepped aside to let him enter. "It's over," he said, his voice hoarse from cold and exhaustion. "For now, the pair is reunited. The highway is closed. The Guardian has gone back to the deep places. And the Scout, healing in the water with its mate, it will live." Siobhan was silent for a long moment, looking out at the receding flood, the fields that were emerging from the water like the continents of a newborn world. "And what about us?" she asked. "What happens to the village, to the people who live here?" "The covenant is restored," Eamon said. "But it's not the same covenant. The Guardian knows about us now. It knows our scents, our sounds, our electromagnetic patterns. It will tolerate us as long as we don't disturb the deep places. But if we do, if anyone drains another bog, breaches another aquifer, opens another highway, there will be no negotiation next time. Only the weight of the water rising." He walked past her into the cottage and sat down at the kitchen table, his hands shaking so badly that he could barely grip the cup of tea she placed before him. The letters were still spread across the table, his grandmother's careful script recording a knowledge that was older than any university degree, and he looked at them with a reverence that was new to him, a respect for the wisdom of people who had learned to live with monsters rather than trying to destroy them. "I'm leaving," he said. "The Guardian made that a condition. I can never return to Leitrim. My scent is marked, my pattern is known. If I stay, the creature will eventually hunt me, not because it wants to kill me, but because it can't forget that I was the one who wounded its mate. I'm a disruption, a variable that needs to be removed from the equation." Siobhan sat down across from him, her own tea untouched. "And where will you go?" "Away, England maybe, Scotland, somewhere with water that doesn't connect to the aquifer, somewhere the Guardian can't follow. You could write about this, publish, make people understand." Eamon shook his head. "The Guardian said I could never speak of what I saw, and I believe it. Not because I'm afraid of breaking a promise to a monster, but because I understand now that some knowledge is too dangerous to share. If people knew about the creatures, really knew with the certainty of direct experience, they would hunt them. They would drain every bog, drill every aquifer, send submarines into every underwater cave, trying to capture or kill what they didn't understand. And in doing so, they would open more highways, create more breaches, unleash more guardians. The old people understood this. They kept the covenant secret not because they were superstitious, but because they were wise." Siobhan picked up her tea and drank, her eyes fixed on the window, the light growing stronger as the sun rose above the horizon. "I found something while you were gone," she said quietly. "In the churchyard, at the base of Grace Connolly's gravestone. The crack that split the stone during the flooding, it didn't split randomly. It followed a line that ran directly through the central image, separating the two creatures. And on the pieces that fell away there were more inscriptions, more Ogham. I copied them down." She reached into her medical bag and pulled out a folded sheet of paper, covered in the careful transcription of a woman who had trained herself to observe and record even in the midst of chaos. Eamon took it and read, his eyes widening as he deciphered the ancient script. "When the stone is broken," he translated, his voice barely more than a whisper, "the highway remains open. The creatures may walk. The water will find its level, and the guardian, once roused, will never sleep again. They looked at each other in the silence of the cottage, the fire dead in the grate, the dawn light casting long shadows across the floor. The covenant was not restored. It was broken beyond repair. The guardian had closed the immediate breach, had collapsed the cavern entrance, had restored the weight of the water to its local level. But the stone was split, the anchor was destroyed, and the highway, the network of waterways that connected the aquifer to the surface, was still there, still open, still waiting. The guardian had not gone back to sleep. It had simply withdrawn to plan, to heal its mate, to prepare for the next intrusion. And when that intrusion came, as it inevitably would, because humans could not resist the temptation to drain and build and conquer, the guardian would rise again, not in morning rage but in calculated fury, and the village of Kilnashanog would learn that the weight of the water was not a memory but a promise, not a legend but a debt that would eventually come due. Eamon folded the paper and placed it in the fire, watching as the flames consumed Siobhan's careful transcription, reducing the ancient warning to ash. "Tell no one," he said. "Burn the letters, destroy every record, and leave this place as soon as you can. The guardian may tolerate the village for now, but the scout remembers what humans did to it. It remembers the chemicals, the wound, the pain. And when it is healed, when it is strong again, it will want revenge. Not on me, I've been banished, removed from its territory, but on the village, on the people who lived here while it suffered, on anyone who smells of the chemicals that poisoned it." Siobhan nodded, her face grave. "I'll transfer to Dublin. I've been planning it anyway." "Good, do it quickly, and never come back." They sat in silence as the sun climbed higher, and the last of the floodwaters drained from the fields, leaving behind a landscape that looked almost normal, almost peaceful, almost as if nothing had happened. But Eamon could see the changes that the water had wrought, the walls that had shifted on their foundations, the trees that leaned at new angles, the drainage ditches that ran in different directions than they had before. The guardian had not just closed the cavern. It had reshaped the land, redirected the water, created new channels and new boundaries that would define the territory for decades to come. And somewhere in the darkness beneath the stone, the pair was healing. The scout was feeding, growing stronger, regenerating the damaged tissues that the poker had torn. The guardian was mapping the new channels, learning the new boundaries, preparing for the next phase of its long and patient existence. They were not sleeping. They were waiting. And the weight of the water, patient and inexorable, was pressing against the stone with a force that no human construction could ever fully contain. Eamon stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the village that had been his grandmother's home and his inheritance, the place where he had learned that the world was larger and stranger, and older than any academic discipline could contain. He would leave today, he decided. He would pack a bag, lock the cottage, and walk to the bus stop without looking back. He would honor the bargain he had made in the flooded excavation, the deal with the creature that was older than his species, and he would spend the rest of his life watching the water, listening for the sound of orange flippers in the night, waiting for the day when the guardian finally found him. Because he knew, with a certainty that ran deeper than any rational thought, that the guardian would find him eventually. Not because it was evil, but because it was water. And water, like memory, will always find its level. The rain began again as he watched, a soft drizzle that fell from a gray sky and turned the muddy fields into mirrors of the clouds. It was not the same rain that had fallen during the flood. It was ordinary rain, the kind that fell on Ireland every day of every year, the kind that had carved the landscape over millennia and would continue to carve it long after humans were gone. But Eamon could not look at it without feeling the weight of what it carried, the pressure of the deep places pressing against the stone, the patient hunger of the creatures that waited in the darkness for the boundary to break. He turned away from the window and began to pack his bag, his movements slow and deliberate, his mind already turning toward the future that waited beyond the horizon. He would write, he decided. He would write everything he had seen and learned, not for publication but for understanding, a private record of the night he had held a dying god in his arms and bargained for the survival of a village. And in the writing, perhaps, he would find some measure of peace, some way of making sense of a world that contained predators older than stone and covenants that bound the living and the dead in a web of mutual terror. But he would never speak of it. He would never publish, never lecture, never share his knowledge with anyone who might be tempted to test the boundary. The old people had kept the covenant secret for a reason, and he would honor their wisdom, even if it meant spending the rest of his life as a man who knew too much and could say too little. He picked up his bag and walked to the door, pausing for a moment in the threshold to look back at the cottage that had been his grandmother's home. The peat fire was dead, the letters were ashes, and the only sound was the rain on the roof and the distant gurgle of water in the drainage ditches. It was over, for now. He stepped out into the gray morning and closed the door behind him, not locking it. There was nothing left inside worth stealing, and the cottage would eventually return to the earth as all human things did, and he walked down the muddy lane toward the bus stop, his boots squelching in the wet ground, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. Behind him, in the fields that stretched toward the coast, the water was rising again, not with the violence of the flood but with the persistence of the tide, seeping through the mud, following the new channels that the Guardian had carved, carrying its ancient passengers toward the surface with a patience that was older than any human impatience. The weight of the water was rising. The covenant was broken, and the Guardian walked, patient and inexorable, into the long night of its claiming. The village survived. Mrs. Monahan recovered from her shock, though she never spoke of what she had seen in her cottage and never returned to live there. Cathal Burns left the area entirely, moving to England where he found work in a factory and never spoke of the creature in the cavern to anyone. Declan Foley, the site manager, resigned from Celtic Horizons and became an environmental activist, campaigning against peatland drainage with a fervor that his colleagues attributed to trauma, but that he knew was simply the truth. Siobhan Curran wrote her report on the deaths of Liam McBride, Seamus Doran, and the others, attributing them to a freak flooding event, an animal attack by an unidentified predator. The report was filed and forgotten, one more unexplained incident in a country that had too many legends and too few answers. Eamon stayed in the cottage for another week, long enough to see the fields dry and the roads reopen, long enough to know that the Guardian had kept its word in the immediate sense. He sorted through his grandmother's possessions with a new reverence, reading her letters not as the ramblings of a superstitious old woman, but as the field notes of a scientist who had studied a subject that official science refused to acknowledge. He found the tuning fork and kept it, a reminder of the night he had held a dying god in his arms and bargained for the survival of a village. And then he left. He locked the cottage and walked to the bus stop with a single bag, not looking back at the stone building that had been his grandmother's home and his inheritance. He took the bus to Carrick-on-Shannon, the train to Dublin, and eventually found passage on a ferry to England, where he lived for 2 years in a small flat in Manchester, working in a bookstore and writing the book that he had always intended to write. It was not the book he had planned. It was not a scholarly treatise on Irish water mythology, not a debunking of folk superstition. It was a memoir, a record of what he had seen and heard and touched, written in the language of a man who had learned that the world was larger and stranger, and older than any academic discipline could contain. He sent the manuscript to a small press in Edinburgh that specialized in what they called speculative nonfiction, and it was published 2 years later to modest reviews and modest sales. He never returned to County Leitrim. The Guardian's warning had been clear, and he honored it. He lived in Manchester for 5 more years, then moved to Glasgow, then to a small village in the Scottish Highlands where the water was cold and clear, and the only legends were of kelpies and water horses that he knew to be cousins of the thing he had faced in the flooded fields of Ireland. But he watched the water. He watched the news reports of strange drownings in remote locations, of bodies found far from any source of water with their lungs full of fresh water, and their skin marked with patterned abrasions. He watched the reports of construction projects abandoned due to equipment failure, of drainage schemes that had mysteriously collapsed, of hydrologists who had gone missing in the night and never been found. And he waited. The autumn morning when it happened was clear and cold, the sky over the highlands a fierce blue that seemed to press down on the earth with an almost physical weight. Eamon stood at the window of his cottage and watched the river that ran past his garden. The water was low, unusually low for the season, and the exposed mud on the banks showed tracks that he recognized with a chill that spread from his spine to his fingertips. Webbed impressions, broad and regular, leading from the water onto the land and back again. And in the mud, gleaming in the morning light, a fragment of something orange, something that had no business in a Scottish river. He did not go down to investigate. He knew what he would find, knew that the Guardian had not forgotten him, knew that the highway had been extended, the aquifer system connected through new channels to new territories. The weight of the water had shifted, the pressure had found new release points, and the creature that had been confined to a single village in County Leitrim was now free to roam wherever the water flowed. He stood at the window until the tracks were erased by the rising tide, until the fragment of orange tissue was washed away by the current, until the river looked once again like any other river in any other part of the world. And then he sat down at his desk and wrote a letter to Siobhan Curran, the first communication between them in 15 years, telling her what he had seen and what he feared. "The highway is open," he wrote, "not just in Leitrim but everywhere the aquifer connects. The Guardian has learned to travel to extend its territory beyond the old boundaries. And the scout that I returned to the depths, it has recovered. It is hunting again, not for food but for new territory, new mates, new boundaries to establish." He sealed the letter and walked to the village post office, mailing it with a sense of finality that was almost peaceful. He had done what he could. He had honored the covenant as long as it was possible to honor it. But the world was changing, the climate shifting, the water tables rising and falling in patterns that no human construction could control. The deep places were connecting to the surface in ways that the old people had never anticipated, and the creatures that lived in those places were adapting, evolving, expanding. He returned to his cottage and stood at the window, watching the river. The sun was setting, casting a golden light across the water that turned it the color of amber, of honey, of the preserved peat that had hidden the aquifer for millennia. And in the light, just for a moment, he saw something move beneath the surface. A flash of orange, a ripple of translucent flesh, a shape that was too large and too wrong to be any fish that had ever swum in Scottish waters. It was watching him. It had found him, tracked him across 15 years and 400 miles, following the water through pipes and streams and rivers until it reached the place where he lived. Not to kill him, not yet, but to remind him. To show him that the covenant was not a permanent solution but a temporary truce, that the weight of the water would always find new ways to press against the stone, and that the creatures of the deep places had longer memories and more patience than any human could ever possess. Eamon raised his hand in a gesture that was half farewell and half surrender. The shape beneath the water did not respond, did not acknowledge the gesture in any way that he could perceive. It simply remained there, suspended in the current, watching and waiting with the patience of geological time. And then it was gone, flowing downstream with the current, its orange flippers carrying it toward the sea, toward the ocean, toward the vast and endless water that covered most of the planet and that had been, for billions of years, the domain of creatures older and stranger and more terrible than any human mind could comprehend. Eamon stood at the window until the light failed and the river became a ribbon of darkness against the darker land. He did not sleep that night, nor the night after, nor any night for the remaining weeks of his life. He sat at his desk and wrote, filling page after page with descriptions of what he had seen, warnings to whoever might come after him, instructions for maintaining a covenant that he knew was already broken beyond repair. When they found him 3 months later, he was sitting at the desk with his pen in his hand and his eyes open, staring at the last page he had written. The page contained a single sentence, repeated over and over in a handwriting that grew progressively more erratic until the final words were barely legible. The weight of the water is rising. The weight of the water is rising. The weight of the water is rising. The coroner ruled it a heart attack, natural causes, the death of a man who had lived too long with too much fear. But Siobhan Curran, who traveled from Dublin to attend the funeral, knew better. She had received his letter, had read his final manuscript, had seen the photographs he had enclosed of the tracks in the Scottish mud. And when she returned to her hotel that evening and turned on the tap to wash her face, she heard something in the pipes that was not the normal rush of water. A high-pitched whine, faint but unmistakable, the echolocation scream of something that was mapping the building, learning the layout, preparing to claim new territory. She packed her bags that night and flew back to Dublin, and she never again lived in a house with a basement, never again walked near a river after dark, never again heard the sound of running water without feeling a chill that had nothing to do with temperature. And in the villages of County Leitrim, in the fields that had once been flooded and were now dry again, the old people still told stories of the Dobhar Chu. They told them to their grandchildren, to the tourists who passed through on walking tour, to anyone who would listen. They spoke of the water hound that guarded the lakes and rivers, the creature that dragged the unwary to their deaths, the monster that could not be killed but only appeased. But they no longer told the stories as warnings. They told them as history, as the record of a time when the covenant held and the boundary was intact. Because they knew, with the knowledge that comes from generations of living close to the water, that the covenant was broken now, the guardian was gone, and the weight of the water was rising everywhere, in every river and stream and pipe, preparing to reclaim the surface world for the darkness beneath. The last sighting was reported by a fisherman on Loch Allen, 3 years after Eamon Brennan's death. He was night fishing for pike, sitting in his small boat with a lantern casting a yellow circle on the black water, when he saw something that made him drop his rod and reach for the oars with hands that shook so badly he could barely grip the wood. It was an orange flipper, rising from the water no more than 20 feet from his boat. Not the flipper of a seal, not the fin of a dolphin, but something larger and more alien, something that slapped against the surface with a sound like wet leather on flesh, and then disappeared with a swirl of bioluminescence that lit the water from below like a submerged star. The fisherman rowed to shore and sold his boat the next day. He moved to Dublin and never fished again. But before he left, he told the story to the local newspaper, and a young reporter who had grown up on the internet and had never heard of the Dobhar Chu wrote it up as a curiosity piece, a human interest story about a superstitious old man and his overactive imagination. The story ran on page 7, beneath an article about a new luxury wellness retreat that was planned for a drained peat bog in the townland of Kilnashannog. The developers, a consortium based in London, promised state-of-the-art facilities, natural hot springs, and an immersive experience of the Irish countryside that would blend ancient tradition with modern comfort. The photograph that accompanied the article showed the site of the development, the black earth of the drained bog stretching toward a horizon where the first construction equipment was already in place. And in the foreground, barely visible, a thin line of moisture extended from the bog across a field of stubble, following the path of an ancient drainage channel toward the distant shimmer of Loch Allen. In the very edge of the photograph, where the line of moisture met the darker soil of the field, something orange caught the light, something that might have been a piece of discarded construction equipment, or a buoy marker, or a fragment of safety netting, or something else. Something that had waited in the darkness for longer than humans had walked the earth. that had survived the draining and the flooding and the death of the scout, that had learned to travel and to hunt, and to claim new territory with the methodical patience of water itself. The article concluded with a quote from the consortium spokesperson. "We are bringing the healing power of water to a new generation. The ancient aquifer system that underlies this region is a treasure that has been hidden for too long. We intend to unlock its potential and share its benefits with the world." The reporter did not notice, and the editor did not care, that the quote was accompanied by a photograph in which the water in the drainage channel was not still. It was moving, flowing against the gradient of the land, as if something beneath the surface were pushing it upward, creating a current that ran from the loch toward the bog, from the deep places toward the surface, from the darkness toward the light. And in the village of Kilnashannog, in the churchyard of St. Mary's, where Grace Connolly's gravestone leaned at its eternal angle beneath the hawthorn tree, the carving of the intertwined pair was no longer visible. The stone had cracked during the flooding, the face splitting along a line that ran directly through the central image, separating the two creatures from each other with a precision that suggested intention rather than accident. The covenant was broken, the pair was separated, and the weight of the water, patient and inexorable, was rising to claim what had always belonged to it. In the end, there was no warning. There was no final confrontation, no heroic sacrifice, no last-minute salvation. There was only the water, moving through channels that humans had opened and could not close, carrying its ancient passengers toward a world that had forgotten how to fear them. The wellness retreat opened on schedule, its first guests arriving on a clear summer morning when the bog was dry and the sky was blue, and the only sound was the distant hum of construction equipment finishing the final touches on the spa complex. The guests were wealthy, cosmopolitan, people who had traveled from London and New York and Tokyo to experience the healing waters of the Irish countryside. They did not experience healing. They experienced something else, something that began with the sound of water in the pipes, not the normal sound of plumbing, but a deeper resonance, a vibration that traveled through the walls and floors of the luxury suites and into the bones of the sleeping guests. They woke to a pressure in their ears, a vertigo that made the room spin, and then to the sight of water seeping through the floorboards, through the walls, through the very foundation of the building that had been constructed on a grave that was older than any human memory. The first body was found in the dry field 3 miles from the retreat, lying on its back with its mouth open in a perfect O of surprise. The lungs were full of fresh water. The skin was covered in deep, rhythmic lacerations that looked less like animal bites and more like the rhythmic scrubbing of a coarse brush. The second body was found in a drainage ditch, the face frozen in an expression of such profound disorientation that the medical examiner who examined it noted in his report that the victim appeared to have died of terror rather than drowning, though the lungs were as waterlogged as any shipwrecked sailor's. The third body was never found. The search teams combed the bog for weeks, using dogs and drones and ground-penetrating radar, but they found nothing. Only a trail of orange fragments, shed like breadcrumbs in the mud, leading from the retreat toward the coast, toward the sea, toward the vast and endless water where the weight of the world was always pressing down, and the creatures that lived in the dark had never learned to fear the light. The retreat closed. The consortium went bankrupt. The lawsuits were filed and settled and forgotten, and the village of Kilnashannog returned to what it had always been, a small cluster of houses in a landscape of water and stone, where the old people told stories to the young and the young pretended not to believe them. But the stories changed. They were no longer about a single creature, a single guardian of a single lake. They were about the water itself, about the weight that pressed against the stone, about the highways that connected every drop of fresh water on the island to every other drop, creating a network of passage and communication that no human eye could see but every human heart could feel. And in the stories, the Dobhar Chu was no longer a monster. It was a principle, A force, the physical manifestation of the covenant that humans had broken and could never restore. It was the weight of the water, rising. It was the memory of the flood that had made the landscape. It was the future that humans had thought they could drain and control and forget. In the last story that anyone told about the creature, an old woman in a cottage near the loch sat by her fire on a winter night and spoke to her granddaughter about the nature of the world. "The water remembers," she said. "Everything that has ever fallen into it, every body that has ever drowned, every secret that has ever been whispered beside it. The water holds the weight of all those memories, pressing down, pressing against the stone. And sometimes when the pressure gets too great, when the weight becomes too heavy for the stone to bear, the water finds a way to the surface." "And then what happens?" the granddaughter asked, though she already knew the answer. "Then the guardian wakes," the old woman said. "The guardian wakes and it walks and it claims what has always belonged to it, not because it is evil but because it is water, and water, like memory, will always find its level." The fire crackled in the grate, and outside the cottage window the rain began to fall. It fell softly at first, then harder, then with a persistence that suggested intention rather than chance. The old woman and her granddaughter sat together in the firelight, listening to the sound of water on the roof, on the walls, on the flooded ground outside. And beneath that sound, barely audible, rising and falling in a pattern that was almost musical, was another sound. A high-pitched whine, a sonic pulse, a question thrown into the darkness to map the shape of the world. The granddaughter pressed closer to her grandmother, feeling the chill that radiated from the window, from the darkness beyond, from the water that was rising everywhere, in every pipe and stream and drain, carrying its ancient passengers toward the light. "Is it coming?" she whispered. The old woman did not answer. She simply sat, her eyes fixed on the fire, her hands folded in her lap, waiting for the weight of the water to find its level. And in the distance, in the flooded fields that stretched toward the coast, something moved. Something that was not wind and not current and not any natural phenomenon that could be explained by the science of the surface world. It was a blur of wet muscle, a shimmer of bioluminescence, the wet slap of orange flippers against stone and mud and grass. It was mapping the territory. It was claiming the land. It was rising, as it had risen before and would rise again, as long as there was water to carry it and stone to press against, and humans foolish enough to believe that they could drain the weight of the world and never pay the price. The rain fell, the water rose, and the guardian walked, patient and inexorable, into the long night of its claiming. Thank you for listening to today's stories. If you enjoyed, please leave a like and subscribe, so you don't miss the stories yet to come.